My name is Thaddeus King. I am 73 years old, and I have spent my entire life turning water, corn, and patience into the finest bourbon in Kentucky. People say making whiskey is an art, but I learned the hard way that it is actually a war against time, against the elements, and sometimes against the people you let sit at your dinner table. After my wife Beatrice died, her children didn't ask for her photo albums. They didn't ask for her favorite scarf. They stood in my living room, eyes dry, and said, "We want the estate, the business, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight. He told me I could crush them in court. Instead, I looked at him and said, "Give it all to them. Give them every single brick." Everyone thought I had lost my mind. They thought grief had made me senile. At the final hearing, I signed the papers with a smile. The kids smiled back, thinking they had won the lottery. They smiled, right up until the moment their lawyer turned pale, dropped the contract on the table, and whispered, "Oh my God, what have you done?" Before I tell you how I destroyed them by giving them exactly what they asked for, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with ungrateful family members who mistook your silence for weakness. 48 hours. That is how long it had been since the heart monitor in the master bedroom flatlined. 48 hours since the love of my life, Beatrice, took her last breath while holding my hand. The house was still filled with the scent of the lilies from the hospice nurse, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was crushing my ribs. I wasn't at the house. I couldn't bear to be there yet. I was sitting in my office at the distillery, King's Reserve. I built this place from the ground up. I started as a janitor sweeping the floors in 1970. I bought the land when it was nothing but mud and debt. Now it was a multi-million-dollar operation producing small-batch bourbon that won gold medals in Paris and Tokyo. I sat in my leather chair staring at a small framed photo of Beatrice on my desk. It was taken on our honeymoon. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the sun catching the silver in her hair. I poured 2 glasses of our 20-year reserve, one for me and one for her empty chair. I raised the glass to the empty room. "To us, B," I whispered. My voice sounded like gravel grinding together. Bam! The heavy oak door to my office didn't just open. It slammed against the wall with a violence that made the glasses on my desk rattle. I didn't jump. You don't get to be 73 years old and a black business owner in the South by being jumpy. I slowly lowered my glass and looked up. Standing in the doorway were Julian and Courtney. Julian was Beatrice's son from her first marriage. He was 35, wearing a suit that was too tight and a watch that cost more than my first car. He looked sweaty, nervous, his eyes darting around the room like a ferret cornered in a pantry. But it was Courtney, his wife, who commanded the space. She was a petite woman with blonde hair cut sharp as a razor blade and eyes that were cold enough to freeze whiskey. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a navy blue power suit carrying a leather briefcase like a shield. Behind them stood 3 men in gray suits, lawyers. I could smell them. They smelled like expensive cologne and billable hours. I took a sip of my bourbon. "The funeral isn't until Thursday," I said calmly. "If you are here to discuss the flower arrangements, you are in the wrong building." Courtney walked into the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the rhythm of an invasion. "We aren't here for flowers, Thaddeus," she said. Her voice was crisp, efficient, completely devoid of sorrow. "We are here for business." She dropped a thick stack of documents onto my desk. It landed right next to Beatrice's photo, knocking the frame face down. I stared at the back of the picture frame. I felt a spark of heat in my chest, but I pushed it down. I reached out and gently stood the photo back up. I wiped a speck of dust from Beatrice's smiling face before looking at Courtney. "My wife died 2 days ago," I said. "Her body is currently at the funeral home, and you are here to talk business." "Beatrice is gone," Courtney said, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "And while that is tragic, the market doesn't stop for grief. King's Reserve is a valuable asset, Thaddeus, but it is bleeding potential." She pulled a chair out and sat down without being invited. Julian remained standing by the door, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "We have been reviewing the numbers," Courtney continued. "You are running this place like a hobby shop. Handwritten ledgers, no digital marketing. A staff that should have retired 10 years ago. It is quaint, but it is not profitable." "Not really." I looked at Julian. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at the cabinet where I kept the rare bottles. "Julian," I said, "you grew up in this house. I paid for your college. I paid for your first rehab. I paid for your second rehab. You don't have anything to say. Julian shuffled his feet. Look, Thad, he mumbled. Courtney has a vision. She went to business school. She knows about scaling and branding. We just think it is time for a transition. A transition, I repeated. Courtney leaned forward. Her eyes scanned my face with a look of pure disdain. Let's be honest, Thaddeus, she said. You are 73. You are tired. And frankly, looking at the demographics of the luxury spirits market, the brand needs a face that is a little more relatable to the new clientele. I knew exactly what she meant. She meant white. She meant young. She meant that a weather-beaten old black man with calloused hands didn't fit her vision of a luxury lifestyle brand. I chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound. So you want to fire me, I said. From my own company. We want you to retire, she corrected. With dignity. She tapped the stack of papers. This is a transfer of control agreement. It grants full executive power to Julian and myself. You retain a 5% honorary stake and a monthly stipend. In exchange, you step down. Immediately. I picked up the document. I didn't read it. I just felt the weight of it. And if I say no, I asked. If I tell you to get the hell out of my office and wait until the reading of the will. Courtney smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a shark that smells blood in the water. We were hoping you wouldn't say no, she said softly. Because that would force us to file the other paperwork. She signaled to one of the lawyers. He stepped forward and placed a manila envelope on the desk. It was marked confidential, medical. What is this, I asked. It is a timeline of Beatrice's decline, Courtney said. We have hired a medical expert to review her care over the last 6 months. It seems there were several instances where she missed her medication, instances where she fell while under your supervision. My blood ran cold. Beatrice had dementia at the end. I had cared for her day and night. I bathed her. I fed her. I held her when she didn't know who I was. Those missed medications were because she refused to swallow them, spitting them out like a child. The falls happened because she tried to walk when I was asleep in the chair next to her bed. We are prepared to file a civil suit for wrongful death due to negligence, Courtney said, her voice smooth as silk. And potentially we will push for a criminal investigation into elder abuse and manslaughter. I stared at her. The room seemed to tilt. You would accuse me of killing her, I whispered. I loved her more than life itself. Courtney shrugged. It doesn't matter what is true, Thaddeus. It matters what it looks like. Imagine the headlines. Bourbon Baron investigated for wife's suspicious death. The brand would be destroyed. Your legacy would be mud. You would spend your final years fighting to stay out of prison instead of fishing. She leaned back, crossing her legs. Or you can sign the transfer. You walk away with a clean reputation and a little bit of money. Julian gets his birthright. And we take this company into the 21st century. I looked at Julian. He was looking at the floor, his face red. You are okay with this? I asked him. You are okay with dragging your mother's memory through the mud to get a paycheck? We need the money, Thad Julian blurted out. I have debts. Bad debts. Courtney shot him a glare to shut him up. So Thaddeus, she said, what is it going to be? Do you want to be a retired legend or a disgraced criminal? I looked at the transfer papers. I looked at the manila envelope full of lies. I felt a rage building inside me, hot and sharp. I wanted to flip the desk. I wanted to throw them out. I wanted to scream until the window shattered. But then I looked at the glass of bourbon in my hand. I remembered what I told my apprentices. You don't fight the fermentation. You control it. If you try to stop the pressure, the barrel explodes. If you guide it, it becomes spirit. They wanted the business. They wanted the estate. They wanted the power. They had no idea what it cost to keep this place running. They saw the gold medals, but they didn't see the sweat. They didn't know about the soil samples, the yeast cultures, the debt covenants, the EPA regulations. They were children playing with a loaded gun, thinking it was a toy. If I fought them, they would destroy my name. They would taint Beatrice's memory. But if I gave them what they wanted, a slow, cold clarity washed over me. I took a sip of the bourbon. It burned on the way down, a familiar, grounding fire. I looked at Courtney. I saw the greed in her eyes. It was a bottomless pit. You want the keys, I asked? All of them, she said. The office, the warehouse, the accounts. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. They clinked together, the sound of 50 years of hard work. I placed them on the desk. You win, I said softly. Julian let out a breath he had been holding. Courtney's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. "Smart choice, Thaddeus," she said, reaching for the pen. I didn't reach for the pen yet. I stood up. I was a tall man, and even at 73 I cast a long shadow. "I will sign," I said. "But I want one thing clarified. Anything Courtney said already uncapping the pen. You want full control, full ownership, full responsibility. Correct?" "Absolutely," she said. "We want to be the sole owners of the King legacy." I nodded. I looked around the office one last time. I looked at the dust motes dancing in the light. "Very well," I said. I sat down. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I wasn't surrendering. I was setting a trap. I signed my name, Thaddeus King. I pushed the papers toward her. "Congratulations," I said, my voice void of any emotion. "You just bought yourself a distillery." Courtney snatched the papers up as if afraid I would change my mind. She grinned at Julian. "We did it." I stood up and grabbed my hat from the rack. I didn't take anything else, not the photos, not the awards. "Where are you going?" Julian asked, surprised. "I am going fishing," I said. I walked to the door. I paused and looked back at them. They were already opening the filing cabinets looking for the bank books. "Good luck," I said. "You are going to need it." I walked out of the office, leaving them alone with their prize. They thought they had stripped me naked. They didn't realize I had just handed them a grenade with the pin pulled out, and the countdown had already started. I walked toward the door of my office, the office I had built with 50 years of sweat and sleepless nights, but my hand never reached the brass knob. "Sit down," Thaddeus Courtney said. Her voice wasn't a request. It was an order, like she was talking to a disobedient dog. I stopped. I turned slowly, leaning on the back of the leather armchair that used to belong to my father-in-law before the business went under, and I bought it back from the bank. "I have signed your papers," I said, my voice low and steady. "I have given you the company. What more do you want?" "We need to secure the physical assets," she said, snapping her fingers. Suddenly the heavy oak door opened again, but it wasn't a lawyer who walked in. It was Sam. Big Sam, the head of security. A man I had hired 20 years ago when he was fresh out of the army and down on his luck. A man whose daughter's tuition I had paid for when she got into Howard University. A man I considered a friend. "Sam," I said, feeling a wave of relief. "Good. Escort these people off the property. They are harassing me." Sam didn't move. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the exit. He was wearing the uniform I had designed with the Gold King's Reserve crest on the chest. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor, twisting his cap in his large hands. "Sam." I repeated, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Did you hear me? I am sorry, Mr. King." Sam mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "I really am. But Mrs. Courtney said my pension was at risk if I didn't cooperate. My wife needs her insulin, sir. You know how it is." I looked at Sam. Then I looked at Courtney. She was smirking, examining her fingernails as if she hadn't just bought a man's loyalty with fear. "Sam works for the company," Thaddeus Courtney said lightly. "And as of 5 minutes ago, Julian and I are the company, so technically Sam works for us. And our first order of business is to ensure that disgruntled former employees don't sabotage the premises." Disgruntled former employee. The words hung in the air like smoke. I wasn't the owner anymore. I wasn't the founder. I was just an old black man trespassing on white property. Sam stepped forward, holding out a plastic bin. "We need your access badge," Mr. King, Sam said softly. "And your phone. It is company property. And the keys to the company vehicle." I looked at Sam. I didn't see a traitor. I saw a victim. A man crushed under the heel of people who thought loyalty was a line item on a spreadsheet. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out my phone. I dropped it into the bin. Clack. I unclipped my access badge from my belt. The one that said founder. I dropped it. Clack. I pulled the keys to the truck out. Not my personal truck. The company truck. The Ford F-150 I used to drive through the muddy fields to inspect the corn harvest. I dropped them. Clack. "Is that all?" I asked, looking straight at Courtney. "Not quite," she said. She stood up and walked around the desk. She stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space. She smelled of vanilla and malice. "We need the iron key," she whispered. The room went dead silent. Even Julian looked up from his shoes. The iron key wasn't on the normal ring. It hung on a separate chain around my neck, tucked under my shirt. It was an old skeleton key, heavy and rusted, that opened the heavy padlock on warehouse number 1. Warehouse number 1 wasn't just a building. It was the sanctuary. It was where we kept the Pappy Van Winkle competitors, the barrels that had been aging for 20-25 years, the experimental batches, the history of the King family in liquid form. I took a step back. My hand instinctively went to my chest. "No," I said. "You don't need that key. That warehouse is climate-controlled manually. Only I know how to adjust the vents. If you open it up, if you let the humidity fluctuate, you will ruin $5 million worth of bourbon." Courtney laughed. $5 million. Is that what it is worth on the books? She turned to Julian. "See, I told you he was hoarding the good stuff." She turned back to me, her hand held out, palm up. "Give it to me, Thaddeus." "You don't understand," I pleaded, trying one last time to appeal to their business sense, if not their humanity. "That whiskey isn't ready. It needs another 3 years in the oak. If you bottle it now, it will be bitter. It will destroy the brand reputation." "You can't rush time, Courtney." "Time is money," she snapped. "We have a liquidity problem, Thaddeus. We have investors lined up who want a quick return. We are going to bottle the reserve stock immediately. We will call it the Founder's Farewell Edition. Marketing gold. We will sell it from $300 a bottle and clear the inventory by Christmas." I stared at her in horror. She was going to take my life's work, the whiskey I had nurtured like a child, and sell it as a gimmick. She was going to drain the barrels dry for a quick cash grab. "You are going to kill the company," I whispered. "If you sell bad whiskey at a premium price, no one will ever buy a bottle of King's Reserve again." "That is our problem, not yours," she said. "The key. Now. Or Sam will take it from you." I looked at Sam. He looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. He wouldn't hurt me, I knew that. But if I forced him to choose between me and his wife's medicine, I would break him. And I wouldn't do that to a man. I reached up. I unbuttoned my collar. I felt the cold metal of the key against my skin one last time. It felt like a heartbeat. I pulled the chain over my head. The heavy iron key swung in the air, catching the light. Courtney's eyes widened. She licked her lips. It was pure greed, naked and ugly. I held the key out, but I didn't drop it in her hand. I held it tight. "You want this?" I asked. "You really want this?" "Yes," she hissed, reaching for it. I pulled it back an inch. "You know," I said slowly, looking from her to Julian, "my father used to say that a key is a dangerous thing. It can open a door to heaven, or it can open a cage for a monster. You think this key unlocks a fortune." I paused. "But you have no idea what you are unlocking." "Just give it to me," Courtney shrieked, losing her patience. She lunged forward and snatched the key from my hand. The chain snapped with a sharp sound. She clutched it to her chest, breathing hard. She looked at Julian, triumphant. "We got it," she said. "We got everything." She turned to Sam. "Escort him out. And Sam, if he tries to take so much as a pencil, you tackle him." I adjusted my hat. I smoothed down my jacket. I looked at the empty desk. I looked at the picture of Beatrice still smiling, unaware that her children were vultures picking the meat off her husband's bones. I didn't feel anger anymore. That hot rage from earlier had cooled into something else, something harder, like steel tempering in oil. They wanted the keys, they wanted the warehouse, they wanted the title. But they didn't know the first rule of whiskey making. You own the barrel, but the angels own the share, and sometimes the angels take more than you expect. I looked at Courtney clutching that iron key like it was the One Ring. She didn't know that the inventory in Warehouse 1 was classified under a special provision in the company bylaws. A provision I had written 40 years ago when I was just a paranoid young man protecting his recipes. She owned the building, she owned the company, but she hadn't read the fine print about the liquid inside the barrels. A strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a man who knows the bridge is rigged to blow and he is the only one who knows where the detonator is. "You have the key. Courtney," I said, my voice low and raspy. "You have the office. You have the name." I walked to the door, stepping aside so Sam didn't have to block me. I stopped in the doorway and looked back. "You wanted it all. So I am giving you all of it. Every headache, every debt, every leaky pipe, and every hidden clause." "What are you mumbling about?" Old man Julian sneered now that he felt safe. "Just go." I looked at Julian. "I hope the money keeps you warm, son," I said, "because winter is coming. And you just kicked out the only man who knows how to keep the furnace running. I walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. People were watching. The secretaries, the bottling line workers, the interns. They stood in the doorways, silent, watching the founder being marched out by security. Some of them were crying. Mrs. Higgins, the bookkeeper, had her hand over her mouth. I didn't look down. I kept my head high. I walked with the rhythm of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to lose. Sam walked beside me, his heavy boots thudding on the concrete. "I am sorry, Mr. King," he whispered again when we reached the exit. I stopped. I put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't be, Sam," I said. "You did what you had to do. Now listen to me." I leaned in close. "Update your resume, Sam, and tell the good guys on the floor, Mrs. Higgins, the distillers, the warehouse crew, tell them to keep their heads down. Do not sign anything. And do not under any circumstances intervene when the machines start to break." Sam frowned. "When they start to break." I smiled, a small cold smile. "Things fall apart when they aren't loved, Sam. Just watch." I pushed open the heavy steel doors and stepped out into the Kentucky sunlight. The air smelled of corn mash and damp earth. It was the smell of home. But it wasn't my home anymore. I walked to the curb. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a phone to call a cab. I was 73 years old, standing on the side of the highway with nothing but the clothes on my back and a hat on my head. A black sedan pulled up. The window rolled down. It was Dante Ross, my personal attorney, the young man I had put through law school. "Get in, Thaddeus," he said, his face grim. "I saw them escort you out on the cameras. Did you sign it?" I opened the door and climbed in. My knees ached. "I signed it, Dante," I said, buckling my seatbelt. Dante hit the steering wheel. "Why? We could have fought them. We could have dragged this out for years. You just handed them a legacy worth $20 million. I looked out the window as we drove away. I watched the distillery disappear in the rearview mirror. The place where I had kissed Beatrice for the first time. The place where I had grieved her. "I didn't hand them a legacy, Dante," I said softly. "I handed them an anchor, and they just tied it around their own necks." Dante looked at me confused. "What do you mean?" "Drive me to the river, Dante," I said, closing my eyes. "I have some fishing to do, and while I am fishing, I want you to pull the deed for the land underneath the parking lot, the one with the EPA restriction." Dante's eyes went wide in the rearview mirror. "The clay deposit." "Exactly," I said. "And then I want you to look up the acceleration clause in the bank loan." "Thaddeus," Dante whispered. "That is nuclear." "No, son," I said, settling back into the seat. "That is just business. They wanted the king's reserve. Now they are going to get the king's justice." I watched the trees blur past. Julian and Courtney were probably popping champagne right now. They were probably toasting to their victory. Let them drink. Let them celebrate. Because tomorrow the hangover begins. The house I shared with Beatrice for 40 years was a sprawling Victorian mansion that sat on the hill overlooking the distillery. It had 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a garden where my wife used to grow prize-winning roses. It took me exactly 2 hours to pack. I didn't take the furniture. I didn't take the expensive rugs or the crystal chandeliers. I took 2 suitcases of clothes, my fishing rods, and a small box containing Beatrice's jewelry and her Bible. I stood in the foyer looking at the grand staircase one last time. Julian and Courtney were already measuring the windows for new drapes. I could hear them in the dining room arguing about whether to paint the mahogany paneling white. They wanted to erase the history. They wanted to make it modern. Courtney walked out holding a swatch of fabric. She stopped when she saw my suitcases by the door. Leaving so soon, she asked, a smirk playing on her lips. "We didn't officially evict you until the 1st of the month. You could have stayed in the guest cottage." I put on my hat. I adjusted the brim so she couldn't see my eyes. "A guest cottage is for guests, Courtney," I said quietly. "And I am not a guest on land I paid for with blood. I am a memory, and memories don't need a roof." I walked out the front door and down the long driveway. I didn't look back. I didn't want them to see the solitary tear that tracked through the dust on my cheek. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in the city above a bakery. It was small. The floorboards creaked and the view wasn't rolling green hills but a brick wall and a fire escape. But it was quiet, and for the first time in weeks the air felt clean. I spent my first night sitting by the window listening to the traffic below. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the distillery. They had the keys, they had the recipes, they had the machines, but they didn't have the secret. You see, making bourbon isn't chemistry, it is biology. It is alive. I remembered teaching Julian when he was 20 back when I still had hope for him. I took him into the rick house, the tall warehouse where the barrels sleep. It was the middle of July, hot and humid. It smells like gym socks in here, Julian had complained, holding his nose. No sun, I had told him. It smells like the angels are breathing. I tried to teach him that you don't use a thermometer to check the mash. You put your hand on the copper pot. You feel the vibration. If it hums like a sleeping cat, the yeast is happy. If it shakes like a washing machine, the heat is too high. I tried to teach him that you don't taste the whiskey to know if it is ready. You listen to the wood. When the oak expands in the summer, it drinks the liquid. When it contracts in the winter, it pushes it back out full of flavor. You have to feel the expansion. You have to walk the rows and touch the barrels. Julian never touched the barrels. He looked at his phone. He looked at the clock. He looked at the profit margins. He thought the magic was in the brand name. He didn't know the magic was in the suffering. Now, sitting in my small apartment, I knew exactly what was happening down at the plant. They were firing up the boilers. They were cranking the heat to speed up production. They were looking at spreadsheets instead of the barometer. They were killing the yeast. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a blocked number, but I knew who it was. Only one person would be arrogant enough to call me at this hour. I picked up. "Hello, Julian. How did you know it was me?" he slurred. He sounded drunk, or manic, probably both. "Because only a thief calls in the middle of the night," I said calmly. "What do you want?" "I want the damn password," he shouted. His voice echoed. He was in the office. My old office. "Which password?" I asked, sitting up in bed. "The accounting system," he yelled. "The main server. Courtney is trying to run the payroll for the new marketing team and the system is locked. It is asking for an admin key." I rubbed my eyes. Of course. They were already trying to move money. They hadn't been in charge for 24 hours and they were already trying to write checks. I sighed. "The password is not written down, Julian. I told you. I kept it in my head." "Well, give it to me, old man," he snapped. "Or do I have to call the lawyers again and tell them you are obstructing the transfer of assets?" I could have hung up. I could have told him to figure it out himself. I could have let them sweat, but that wasn't the plan. If you block an enemy, they dig in. If you open the gate, they run through it right off the cliff. I turned on the bedside lamp. I picked up a pen and a notepad. "Are you ready?" I asked. Yeah, hurry up," he said. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. Courtney was there too, listening. "The password is case sensitive," I said. Capital B, lowercase EATRICE1974, Beatrice, 1974. There was a pause on the line. "Mom's name," Julian muttered. "And the year you bought the land." "Yes," I said. "It opens everything, Julian. The payroll, the vendor contracts, the bank lines of credit, and the debt schedules." "Got it," he said. I heard the beep of the enter key, then a cheer. "We are in." He laughed. A cruel, victorious sound. "See, Thaddeus, was that so hard? We don't need you, we just needed your codes. Now go back to sleep. Try not to die in that dump you rented." He was about to hang up. "Julian," I said. My voice was sharp enough to cut through his drunken haze. What he snapped. "I just gave you the keys to the kingdom," I said. "But I need to give you a warning." "We don't need your warnings," he scoffed. "You do," I said, "because you are looking at the available balance column right now, and it looks like a lot of money." "It is a lot of money," he bragged. $3 million in cash." "Yes," I said, "but you haven't clicked on the tab marked liabilities yet." I leaned back against the headboard. "Be careful with the numbers, Julian. They look tame on a screen, but if you don't treat them with respect—" I paused for effect. "They bite." I hung up the phone. I stared at the wall. He wouldn't look at the liabilities tab. Not tonight. They were too busy celebrating the $3 million in the operating account. They didn't know that $3 million was earmarked for the grain suppliers, the barrel coopers, and the federal excise tax due next week. They thought it was profit. They were about to spend the tax money on new office furniture. I turned off the light and pulled the thin blanket up to my chin. "Sleep tight, Julian," I whispered to the dark room, "because the numbers are waking up. And they are very, very hungry." The apartment above the bakery smelled of yeast and cinnamon, a scent that used to remind me of the mash tanks at the distillery. Now it just reminded me of what I had lost. I spent my days sitting in a second-hand armchair, staring at the brick wall across the alley, my phone resting on the small side table like a dormant grenade. I didn't need to visit the distillery to know what was happening. I had eyes everywhere, the cleaning crew, the delivery drivers, the people invisible to women like Courtney and men like Julian. They were my network, my underground resistance whispering reports to me through encrypted text messages and hushed phone calls. And the news they brought was a massacre. It started on a Tuesday morning. Courtney arrived in her Porsche wearing sunglasses that covered half her face, holding a clipboard that acted as her executioner's axe. She didn't call a meeting. She didn't look people in the eye. She just pointed. You, and you, out. Mrs. Higgins, who had managed the accounts payable since 1985, was given 10 minutes to pack her box. She was 68 years old, a widow who treated every dollar in the company account as if it were her own. Courtney told her she was redundant. She said they were moving to a cloud-based AI system that didn't require manual entry. Then came the bottling line. Most of the men there were guys I had grown up with, men with gray in their beards and arthritis in their knuckles, men whose skin looked like the dark oak of the barrels they handled. They were slow, maybe, but they were precise. They knew that if you shook the bottle too hard during the filling, you bruised the spirit. Courtney fired them all. 12 men, 80 years of collective experience wiped out in an afternoon. She told them they didn't fit the new aesthetic. The new aesthetic. By Wednesday, the replacements arrived. They were kids. 20-something hipsters with manicured beards and ironic tattoos recruited from a temp agency in the city. They didn't know the difference between bourbon and rye. They didn't care about the craft. They cared about the paycheck and the Instagram opportunities. I watched the photos pop up on social media. My phone screen became a window into hell. There were pictures of the new staff leaning against the copper pot stills, flashing peace signs, wearing t-shirts that said Bourbon Bay. Courtney had installed neon lighting in the fermentation room, pink and blue neon, in a room that required total darkness and temperature control to let the yeast sleep. She was turning my cathedral into a nightclub. My chest ached. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I wanted to march down there. I wanted to tear down the neon lights and apologize to every single person she had humiliated. But I stayed in my chair. I drank my tea. I waited. Then came the call that almost broke me. It was Thursday evening. Dante Ross, my lawyer, burst into my apartment without knocking. He was out of breath. His tie loosened his face slick with sweat. "Thaddeus," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "You have to stop them. You have to intervene. This goes beyond bad business." "This is sacrilege." I looked at him over the rim of my teacup. "Sit down, Dante," I said softly. "You are letting the heat get to you." He didn't sit. He paced the small room, waving his arms. "They opened warehouse number 1, Thaddeus." My hand froze. The teacup rattled against the saucer. Warehouse number 1. The sanctuary. The place where I kept the 20-year-old barrels. The reserve stock that was meant to be the legacy of the King name. "They cut the lock," Dante shouted. "They used bolt cutters because you wouldn't give them the key. And they are rolling the barrels out. Right now." I set the tea down slowly. I didn't want to drop it. "What are they doing with them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They are bottling it," Dante said, his voice cracking. "They are dumping 20-year-old single-barrel bourbon into the mixing vats. They are diluting it with the cheap 3-year-old stuff from the back lot to increase the volume." I closed my eyes. Diluting it. It was like taking a masterpiece painting and using it to patch a hole in the roof. "Why?" I asked. "Because they are broke," Dante said. Julian spent the operating cash on a new fleet of company cars and a renovation of the executive suite. They have a liquidity crunch. So Courtney decided to launch a flash sale. He pulled out his phone and showed me a digital flyer. The King's Founder Edition. Rare 20-year blend. Only $49.99. Get it while it lasts. $50. They were selling bourbon that was worth $500 a bottle for $50. They were liquidating the company's most valuable asset for pennies on the dollar just to pay the electric bill. "They are destroying the brand," Dante yelled. "Once people taste that swill, that mix of gold and garbage, the reputation of King's Reserve is dead. No connoisseur will ever touch us again. Thaddeus, we have to file an injunction. We have to sue for mismanagement. We can argue they are violating the fiduciary duty to the minority shareholder." "That is you." I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out at the brick wall. I could see it in my mind. the forklift tearing through the quiet dust of Warehouse 1, the bung hammers smashing open the seals, the golden liquid aged for 2 decades in silence and darkness being churned into a stainless steel vat with cheap, immature spirits. It hurt more than the day I lost the building. It hurt more than the disrespect. It felt like they were bleeding me dry. But then I remembered the trap. I remembered the contract they had signed. I remembered the specific wording of the transfer agreement. I turned back to Dante. He was already pulling legal pads out of his briefcase, ready to go to war. "Put the paper away, Dante," I said. He looked at me stunned. "What?" I said, "Put it away. We are not suing. We are not filing an injunction." "But Thaddeus," he pleaded, "they are killing your baby. They are bleaching the soul out of the place. If we wait, there will be nothing left to save." I walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. I felt the tension vibrating in his body. He was a good man. He loved the distillery almost as much as I did. "Dante," I said gently, "do you know why I built warehouse number 1 with a dirt floor instead of concrete?" He blinked, confused by the sudden change of topic. Because it helps regulate the humidity." "Yes," I said. "And do you know what happens when you disturb the ecosystem of a dirt floor warehouse that hasn't been opened in 20 years? He shook his head. I smiled. It was a sad smile, but it had teeth. "When you roll those heavy barrels out, you disturb the soil. You change the airflow. And if you aren't careful, if you don't know the land, you wake up things that have been sleeping." I walked back to my chair and sat down. "Courtney wants to sell the reserve stock. She wants to make a quick $1 million to cover her mistakes. She thinks she found a treasure chest." I picked up my tea. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway. "Let them do it, Dante." "Thaddeus, are you insane?" Dante whispered. "No," I said. "I am patient." I leaned forward. "They are bottling the inventory. That means they are claiming ownership of the inventory. They are putting their names on the labels. They are taking the money for the sale." "Yes," Dante said. "That is the problem." "No," I said. "That is the evidence." I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7 p.m. They were probably running the bottling line right now, pushing the workers to go faster, spilling precious drops on the floor in their greed. "Dante," I said, "I want you to go home. I want you to sleep. And tomorrow morning I want you to go to the courthouse, not to file a lawsuit." Then what, he asked. "I want you to pull the original land survey from 1974, I said. The one attached to the EPA deed restriction. And I want you to be ready. Ready for what? Ready for the moment they realize that by opening Warehouse 1 they didn't just find whiskey. They found the reason I got that land for cheap." Dante stared at me. He was starting to understand. The gears were turning behind his eyes. "The soil," he whispered. "The soil," I agreed. "Let them bottle it, Dante. Let them ship it. Let them cash the checks. Because the higher they climb on this mountain of greed, the harder they are going to fall when the ground gives way." Dante slowly put his notepad away. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. "You knew they would do this," he said. "You knew they would go for the quick cash." "I didn't know," I said, looking back out the window. "But I hoped." I took a deep breath. "Go home, son. Let the children play with their matches. We will be there with the fire extinguisher when the house starts to burn, but not a second before." Dante nodded. He walked to the door, then stopped. "It is hard to watch, Thaddeus. It is hard to watch them desecrate it." "I know," I whispered. He left, closing the door softly. I sat alone in the dark. I could feel the distance between me and my life's work growing, stretching like a rubber band. Courtney thought she was winning. She thought she was erasing me. She was firing my people, painting over my history, and selling my soul for $50 a bottle. But she forgot one thing. Bourbon has a memory. It remembers the corn. It remembers the wood. And it remembers the hands that made it. And it never ever forgives a traitor. I closed my eyes and waited for the crash. The elevator ride to the 14th floor of the Ross & Associates building was silent. I stood in the corner of the metal box, watching the numbers tick upward. I was wearing my Sunday suit, the one Beatrice used to iron for me. It was a little loose around the waist now. Stress is a diet that no doctor recommends, but it is effective. When the doors opened, I didn't see a receptionist. I saw Dante Ross waiting for me in the hallway. He wasn't wearing his lawyer face, he was wearing the face of a terrified son. "Thaddeus," he said, grabbing my hand, "thank God you are here. Please tell me you changed your mind. Please tell me we are filing the injunction today." I looked at the young man. I remembered him as a skinny kid running around the bottling line while his father, my old foreman, shouted at him to stay away from the glass. I had paid for his undergraduate degree. I had paid for law school. I had bought him his first suit. He wasn't just my lawyer. He was the son I wished Julian had been. I walked past him toward his office. "Is the coffee hot, Dante?" I asked. He stuttered, following me. "Yes, it is hot. But Thaddeus, listen to me. I saw the sales figures. I saw the marketing plan. They are going to bankrupt the company in 6 months." I walked into his office and sat down in the heavy leather chair. The view from the window was spectacular. You could see the whole city, and if you squinted, you could see the green hills where my distillery lay, choking under the weight of neon lights and greed. Dante slammed the door shut and paced the room. "They are selling the reserve stock for $50, Thaddeus. $50. It is criminal. If we file for a competency hearing or if we argue breach of fiduciary duty, we can freeze their assets. We can stop them." He slammed his hands on his desk, leaning over to look me in the eye. "Why are you letting them do this? You are giving a loaded gun to a robber and hoping he doesn't shoot you." I took off my hat and set it on the desk. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the silver carafe. I took a sip. It was bitter. "Good. Sit down, Dante," I said. He didn't move. "Sit down, son," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. Dante sank into his chair, looking defeated. He ran a hand through his hair. "I just don't understand, Thaddeus. You fought for that land. You fought the banks. You fought the racism. You fought the drought of '88. And now you are just surrendering." I looked at the steam rising from the coffee cup. "Do you remember the first lesson I taught you about bourbon, Dante?" I asked. Dante blinked. He looked confused. "Thaddeus, we are talking about a $20 million lawsuit, not a tasting class." "Humor me," I said. "What is the most important part of the whiskey?" Dante sighed. "The water. The limestone water from the aquifer." "No," I said. "The mash bill," he guessed. "The percentage of corn to rye." "No." I leaned forward. "It is the barrel, Dante. The wood." I tapped the mahogany desk with my finger. "You can take the purest water in Kentucky. You can take the finest corn. You can distill it until it is clear as a diamond. But if you put it in a barrel made of rotten wood, it becomes poison." I sat back. The wood decides the flavor. The wood decides the color. The wood decides if the spirit matures or if it spoils. Dante stared at me. He was starting to listen. "Julian and Courtney are the spirit right now," I said. "They are raw. They are volatile. They think they are powerful because they have high proof. But I am the cooper. I built the barrel they are sitting in." I took another sip of coffee. "And Dante, I built that barrel with some very specific leaks." Dante's eyes narrowed. "Leaks." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a list. A list of things that Courtney in her arrogance had never bothered to check. They want the assets, Dante. They want the title of CEO. They want the bank accounts. But they forgot that in business you cannot take the assets without taking the liabilities. I slid the paper across the desk. Dante picked it up. He started to read. His eyes widened. "Item 1. The EPA deed restriction on the south parking lot," he read aloud. I nodded. "The clay cap. It covers a chemical dump from the 1950s. If anyone disturbs the surface soil, the EPA fines are $5,000 a day." Dante looked up. "Courtney wants to expand the parking lot. She ordered bulldozers for next week." "I know," I said. He looked back at the list. "Item 2. The bank loan acceleration clause." I nodded again. "If the founder, that is me, is removed from active management, the interest rate jumps from 2% to 12%, and the principal becomes due in 30 days. Dante gasped. "That is $5 million due next month. They don't have that kind of cash." "Read item 3, I said. Item 3, Dante read. "The inventory classification." He stopped. He read it again. He looked at me, his mouth open. "Thaddeus, is this real? Does this clause actually exist in the original incorporation papers?" I smiled. I wrote it myself in 1974, Dante, back when I didn't trust my first partner. It states that the reserve inventory, any barrel aged over 10 years, is considered the personal artisan property of the master distiller held in trust by the company, not owned by it. Dante started to laugh. It was a nervous, incredulous laugh. So he said, shaking his head, "You are telling me that they are currently selling whiskey that legally belongs to you?" I shrugged. "They are selling my property without my permission. They are digging up a toxic waste site, and they are triggering a bank default." I stood up and walked to the window. "You said I was giving a gun to a robber, Dante. You were wrong." I turned back to him. "I am giving a rope to a man standing on a trap door." Dante looked at the list, then at me. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He was a lawyer again, and he smelled blood. "So, what do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to draft the transfer agreement," I said. "The transfer agreement?" he asked. "Yes, the one they asked for, the one that gives them everything." I walked over to the desk and tapped the legal pad. "I want you to write it exactly as they requested. Transfer of all assets, liabilities, and operational control. Make the font for liabilities the same size as assets. Do not hide it. Put it right there in black and white." But Thaddeus, Dante said, "If they sign that, they are signing their own death warrant." "They won't read it, Dante," I said. "They are too busy measuring the drapes. They are too busy counting the money they think they have." Dante picked up his pen. His hand was steady now. "And the inventory clause," he asked. "Do I include that?" "Put it in the appendix," I said. "Buried deep. Make it look like standard boilerplate text about storage fees." Dante nodded. He began to write. I watched him. I felt a heavy sadness in my chest. I didn't want this. I wanted Julian to be a son. I wanted to leave the business to him with pride. I wanted to teach him the secrets of the wood. But he chose the shortcut. And in the whiskey business, there are no shortcuts. Only bad batches. "When will it be ready?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," Dante said. "Good," I said. "Call them. Tell them I am ready to surrender. Tell them I am beaten. Tell them I am old and tired and I just want my check." I put my hat back on. "Make them feel like kings, Dante, because the fall is much more painful when you think you are flying." I walked to the door. Thaddeus, Dante called out. I turned. "What happens when the bank calls the loan?" he asked. I smiled. A cold, winter smile. "Then we see if Julian knows how to swim." I walked out of the office. The elevator ride down felt faster than the ride up. I stepped out into the street. The noise of the city washed over me. I walked to the bus stop. I didn't mind the bus. It gave me time to think, time to pray. I prayed for Beatrice. I prayed for forgiveness for what I was about to do to her son. But mostly I prayed for the bourbon. I hoped the angels would protect it for just a little longer, because the devil was coming to collect his due, and he was bringing a contract signed in ink and greed. The conference room at Ross & Associates was designed to intimidate. It was a glass cage suspended 14 stories above the city, filled with the smell of lemon polish and the low hum of expensive air conditioning. I walked in with my hat in my hand. Dante Ross walked beside me carrying the briefcase that contained the death warrant for my company. He looked pale. He kept adjusting his tie, checking his watch, sweating despite the chill in the room. But I wasn't sweating. I felt a strange, cold clarity. It was the same feeling I used to get right before a thunderstorm broke over the distillery when the air pressure dropped and the birds stopped singing. They were waiting for us at the head of the table. Courtney and Julian. If they looked arrogant in my office 2 days ago today, they looked like royalty. Courtney was wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged on a yacht in the Mediterranean. She had a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist that caught the overhead lights, sending little sharp daggers of glare across the mahogany table. Julian was wearing a suit that was a shade of blue too bright for business. He was leaning back in the chair, his feet resting on the rungs, spinning a gold pen between his fingers. He looked like a man who had just won the Super Bowl without playing a single minute of the game. "Ah, the former CEO arrives," Julian said, not bothering to stand up. "You are 5 minutes late, Thaddeus." In the new King's Distillery, punctuality is going to be a core value. I pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table. I sat down slowly. I placed my hat on the empty seat next to me. "I am not the CEO anymore, Julian," I said calmly. "I am just a signatory, and traffic doesn't care about your core values." Courtney smiled. It was a tight plastic smile. "Let's not bicker," she said, smoothing her dress. "We are here to finalize the transition. It is a happy day. We are keeping the business in the family. That is what Beatrice would have wanted." Don't say her name, I thought, but I kept my face like stone. Dante opened his briefcase. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out the document. It was 3 inches thick, the Transfer of Assets and Liabilities Agreement. He placed it in the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "This is the standard transfer agreement," Dante said, his voice tight. "As requested, it grants full operational control, all physical assets, all brand intellectual property, and all financial instruments to the new entity formed by Mr. Julian and Mrs. Courtney." He paused, looking at me, then at them. "It also includes the full assumption of all debts, obligations, and regulatory compliance requirements." Courtney waved her hand dismissively. Yes, the legal mumbo-jumbo," she said. "We know. We get the assets, we pay the bills. It is how business works. Just show us where to sign." She reached for the document. "Hold on," Julian said. He sat up, putting his elbows on the table. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check. He slid it across the long, polished surface of the table. It stopped right in front of me. I looked down. It was a cashier's check for $100,000. "What is this?" I asked. "It is a severance package," Julian said, grinning. "Or a retirement gift. Call it what you want." He leaned back, looking pleased with himself. "Courtney and I talked about it. The original agreement said we only had to pay you a monthly stipend, but we felt generous. We figured you might want to buy a little fishing boat, or maybe move into a nice condo in Florida where the humidity is better for your joints." He laughed. A short, cruel bark. $100,000. For a company that generated $10 million in revenue last year. For the land. For the brand. For 50 years of my life. They were buying my legacy for the price of a used luxury car. I looked at the check. I didn't touch it. "You are very generous, Julian," I said softly. "Don't spend it all in one place, old man," he sneered. "And don't gamble it away. I know how you like to take risks, like that time you bought the clay plot in the 70s. Bad investment, right?" He was mocking me. He was bringing up the very land that was about to destroy him, and he was using it as a punchline. The irony was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like metal. I looked at Dante. He was staring at his shoes, trying to hide his disgust. I picked up the pen. "Are we doing this?" I asked. "We are doing this," Courtney said. Her eyes were locked on the document. She was practically vibrating with greed. She saw the finish line. She saw the millions in the bank account. She didn't see the cliff. I opened the document to the signature page. Dante had done exactly what I asked. The font was clear. The words were bold. "I, Thaddeus King, hereby transfer all rights, titles, and interests." And right below it, in the same size font, "And the transferee hereby assumes full personal liability for all regulatory covenants, environmental restrictions, and debt acceleration clauses attached to said properties." It was right there. They didn't even have to turn the page. It was staring them in the face. But they weren't looking at the words. They were looking at the keys sitting on the table next to the contract. I signed, "Thaddeus King." The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the quiet room. It sounded like a lock clicking shut. I pushed the document toward them. "It is your turn," I said. Courtney grabbed the pen before the paper even stopped moving. She signed with a flourish, a big looping signature that took up half the page. Julian signed next to her. He didn't even look at the page. He was looking at me, smiling, that arrogant, victorious smile. "Done," he said, dropping the pen. "Done," Courtney echoed. She snatched the document up and handed it to their lawyer, who stuffed it into his briefcase as if he were afraid I would try to eat it. "Well," Thaddeus Courtney said, standing up, "I would offer you a drink to celebrate, but we are saving the good stuff for the launch party tonight. You know, the Founder's Farewell Edition." She picked up the keys. She jingled them. I stood up. My knees popped. I felt light. Incredibly, terrifyingly light. The weight of the company, the weight of the debt, the weight of the EPA, the weight of the bank, it was all gone. It had just transferred across the table to the woman in the white dress. I picked up my hat. I picked up the check for $100,000. I folded the check and put it in my pocket. "Thank you for the drink offer, Courtney," I said, "but I have my own bottle at home." I looked at Julian. "You said I made a bad investment in the 70s, Julian. The clay plot." "Yeah," he laughed. "Useless dirt. You can't grow corn on clay." I nodded slowly. "You are right, son. You can't grow corn on clay, but you can bury things in it." Julian frowned. What is that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. I looked at Dante. Are we finished here, counselor? We are finished, Mr. King Dante said. I turned to leave. I walked to the door, my steps echoing on the marble floor. Wait, Courtney called out. I stopped my hand on the door handle. What is the passcode for the safe in the office? She asked. You never gave it to us. I turned back. They were standing there, the keys in their hands, the contract signed, the world at their feet. They looked so powerful. They looked so doomed. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. The safe is open. Courtney, I said. I left it unlocked for you. She frowned. Why? Because there is nothing in it, I said. I opened the door. You have the contract, Julian. You have the keys. You have the title. I looked them both in the eye. It is yours. All of it. The profits, the problems, the history. I put my hat on my head. Good luck with the legacy. I walked out. I heard Julian laugh behind me. Crazy old coot, he said. He thinks he is being profound. I walked down the hallway to the elevator. Dante was right on my heels. He looked like he was about to pass out. Thaddeus, he whispered as the elevator doors closed, shutting out the sight of the Ross & Associates logo. They didn't even read the environmental clause. They didn't even look at the appendix. I watched the numbers on the display tick down. 14, 13, 12. Greed makes you blind, Dante, I said. They were looking at the mountaintop. They forgot to look at the trail, but the bank, Dante said. When they trigger the acceleration, I held up my hand. Not yet, I said. Let them have their party. Let them pop the champagne. Let them feel like gods for one night. The elevator hit the lobby with a soft ding. The doors opened. I walked out into the busy street. The sun was shining. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't have a company to run. I didn't have a payroll to meet. I hailed a taxi, whereto the driver asked. The river, I said. I had a date with a fishing pole. And Julian had a date with destiny. He just didn't know it yet. As the taxi pulled away, I touched the pocket where the check was. $100,000. I would frame it. I would hang it on my wall. A souvenir of the day I sold my enemies the rope they used to hang themselves. I sat in my small apartment above the bakery, the smell of rising dough battling with the scent of the city exhaust drifting through my open window. It was Friday night. Down at the distillery just 5 miles away, the sky was lit up with spotlights. I didn't need to be there to see it. I just had to open my phone. Courtney and Julian were live streaming. I watched on the small cracked screen of my phone as my life's work was turned into a backdrop for their vanity. They had transformed the loading dock into a dance floor. There were velvet ropes. There were servers carrying trays of my 20-year reserve, mixing it with Diet Cola and energy drinks. I watched Courtney hold her phone up high, capturing the crowd of strangers who were drinking my bourbon without tasting it. She was wearing a silver dress that sparkled under the strobe lights. "Hey guys," she shouted over the thumping bass of the music. "Welcome to the new King's Distillery. We are finally bringing some class to this place. Look at this turnout. We are disrupting the industry. We are the future." She panned the camera to Julian. He was standing on a table, a bottle of reserve in one hand and a cigar in the other. He looked sweaty and manic. To the Kings, he roared, spilling whiskey down his chin. To the new era. Out with the old, in with the gold. The crowd cheered. They didn't know they were cheering for a funeral. I turned off the phone. I couldn't watch them spill anymore. It felt like watching someone bleed. But while they were dancing, something else was happening. Something silent. Something dangerous. The distillery wasn't just a building, it was a living, breathing beast. And like any beast, it reacted to stress. I had built the ventilation system in warehouse number 4 myself in 1982. It wasn't a modern HVAC system with digital thermostats. It was a system of louvers and vents operated by a series of heavy iron chains and pulleys. We called it the iron lung. Every morning at 5 a.m. for 40 years, I would walk through the warehouse. I would lick my finger and hold it up to test the wind. I would check the humidity in the air. If it was a dry heat, I closed the lower vents to trap the moisture. If it was a wet, heavy heat, I opened the roof cupolas to create a draft. You had to drive it like a car. You had to listen to it. But Julian didn't know about the iron lung. He didn't know that the passive airflow was the only thing keeping the internal temperature from spiking to 120 degrees in the Kentucky summer. And this week we were in the middle of a heat wave. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. I could imagine the inside of the warehouse right now, the heat rising from the asphalt parking lot, the sun beating down on the tin roof, the air inside becoming heavy, thick, and suffocating. Inside those barrels, the whiskey was expanding. It was pushing against the wood. It was desperate to breathe. But the vents were closed because no one had pulled the chains. The pressure was building. Back at the party, the music was getting louder. The bass was vibrating the ground. One of the new employees, a young kid named Kevin, who Julian had hired to replace my foreman, was standing near the control panel for the fermentation tanks. I knew Kevin. He was a nice kid, but he thought whiskey was made by pushing buttons. I imagined the scene. I didn't need a camera. I knew the rhythm of disaster. Kevin was probably looking at the pressure gauge on tank 3. The needle was probably in the red, because when you play loud music with heavy bass next to a fermentation tank, the vibration agitates the yeast. It wakes them up. It makes them work too fast. The heat from the fermentation rises uncontrollably. I could see Kevin running through the party, dodging the dancers trying to find Julian. Mr. King, Kevin would say, shouting over the music. "Mr. King, we have a problem." Julian would look down from his table, annoyed that his celebration was being interrupted. "What is it?" he would snap. "Can't you see I am busy?" "The temperature in the mash tun is spiking," Kevin would say, "and the sensors in the warehouse are blinking. It says the humidity is critical." Julian would laugh. He would wave his hand, splashing expensive bourbon on the floor. "It is just a glitch, kid," Julian would say. "That equipment is older than you are. It is always blinking." Thaddeus was too cheap to upgrade it. But Sir Kevin would persist. "The reading is really high. Should we turn on the emergency fans?" Julian didn't know where the switch for the emergency fans was. I had hidden it behind a false panel to keep people from bumping it. "Just ignore it," Julian would yell. "We are buying all new digital tanks next week anyway. Just let it run. If it breaks, we will replace it. Go get a drink, enjoy the party. If it breaks, we will replace it." That was the mantra of his generation. Dispose, replace, upgrade. But you can't replace a 20-year-old barrel. Once the wood splits, the time is lost. Once the spirit evaporates, it is gone forever. I sat in my apartment listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I knew what was happening in the dark silence of the warehouse while the party raged outside. The heat was forcing the liquid deep into the wood staves. Too deep. The pressure was popping the bungs, the wooden stoppers, just a fraction of an inch. The angels share. The alcohol vapor that usually evaporates slowly over years was now pouring out into the enclosed space. The air in the warehouse was becoming explosive. It was thick with ethanol fumes. One spark, one faulty wire, one cigarette tossed carelessly by a party guest wandering where they shouldn't be, and boom. But the explosion didn't happen that night. The angels were merciful, or maybe they were just waiting for a better moment. Instead, the machines just started to die. The antique boiler, the heart of the distillery, began to shudder. It was used to the gentle hand of old Mr. Henderson, who knew exactly how much coal to feed it. Now it was running on autopilot, pushed to maximum capacity to fill the founder's farewell bottles. It hissed. It groaned. A safety valve blew, sending a jet of steam into the air. At the party, the guests cheered when they heard the noise. They thought it was part of the show. They thought it was a special effect. "Whoo!" Courtney screamed into the microphone. "Feel that power. That is the sound of money making money." She raised her glass. "To the new empire," she yelled. I opened my eyes. I looked at the check sitting on my table. $100,000. I picked it up. I walked to the small kitchenette. I opened the drawer and took out a roll of Scotch tape. I taped the check to the refrigerator door. It wasn't money to me. It was a scoreboard. They were celebrating their honeymoon with the business. They were in the phase where everything is exciting, where the flaws look like quirks, where the danger looks like adventure. But honeymoons end. And when they woke up tomorrow, they would find that the marriage bed was cold, the house was falling apart, and the spouse they chose the business was a high-maintenance beast that demanded blood, sweat, and respect. 3 things they didn't have. I went back to the window. The spotlights were still sweeping the sky. "Dance, Julian," I whispered. "Dance, Courtney. Shake the floorboards. Crack the foundations." I imagined the whiskey in the barrels swirling in the dark, listening to the disrespect. The spirits were angry. And unlike me, they didn't have to sign a non-aggression pact. Tomorrow the heat wave was supposed to get worse, 100 degrees. And tomorrow, without me there to open the vents, the iron lung would stop breathing. I poured myself a glass of water. It was tap water. It tasted of chlorine and city pipes. It wasn't the sweet limestone water of the distillery. I drank it anyway. It was the taste of patience. I went to bed. I slept soundly, lulled by the knowledge that physics, unlike family, never betrays you. Physics always keeps its promises, and the promise of heat and pressure is always inevitably destruction. The river was calm that morning. I sat on the bank with a fishing pole in my hand, watching the mist rise off the water. It had been exactly 30 days since I walked out of the distillery. 30 days of silence. 30 days of waking up in a small apartment instead of the home I built for my wife. Most people would think I was lonely, but I wasn't. I was waiting. You see, banking is a lot like fishing. It requires patience, it requires the right bait, and most importantly, it requires a sharp hook. And 30 days ago, when I signed those papers, I baited the hook with $5 million of debt. I looked at my watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Right about now, the mailman was walking up the steps of the new executive offices. He was carrying a certified letter in a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't an invoice for bottles. It was a notice from First Commercial Bank. I could see the scene in my mind as clearly as if I were standing there. Courtney was probably sitting at my old mahogany desk, the one she had refinished in a tacky white lacquer. She was likely yelling at an assistant about the new logo design, feeling powerful, feeling invincible. Julian was probably on the leather couch nursing a hangover and scrolling through comments on their social media page, deleting the negative ones from the loyal customers who said the new bourbon tasted like watered-down vanity. Then the assistant would walk in. She would place the envelope on the desk. Registered mail. Urgent. Courtney would frown. She would pick up her silver letter opener. She would slice the paper, and then the world would stop spinning. I reeled in my line, checking the bait. The worm was still there. The fish weren't biting today. But the sharks were definitely circling. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Dante. "It happened," he said. His voice was breathless. "The bank just called their legal team. They served the notice." "Tell me," I said, casting my line back into the water. "It is the acceleration clause, Thaddeus, just like you said." Of course it was. When I took out that loan 5 years ago to expand the bottling line, the bank president, old Mr. Franklin, looked me in the eye. He said, "Thaddeus, I am lending this money to you, not the company, to you. Your character is my collateral." So we put a clause in the contract, a key man clause. It stated very simply that if Thaddeus King ceased to be the active CEO for any reason other than death or incapacitation, the terms of the loan would be considered voidable by the lender. The preferential interest rate of 2% gone. The 20-year repayment schedule gone. The letter Courtney was holding right now said something very different. "Dear Mrs. King Vance, due to the material change in management and the unauthorized transfer of executive control, First Commercial Bank is exercising its right under Section 4, Paragraph B of the loan agreement. The acceleration clause is hereby activated. The outstanding principal of $5,200,000 is due in full. You have 30 days to remit payment." I closed my eyes and let the river breeze hit my face. $5 million. They had burned through the $3 million in the operating account in the first 2 weeks. I knew they had. I saw the new cars in the parking lot. I saw the invoices for the office renovation. I saw the marketing agency bills. They were broke. And now the bank wanted a check that would bounce so hard it would crack the pavement. Dante was still talking on the phone. I heard from a source in the office. He said, "It is chaos over there. Julian is throwing up in the private bathroom. He is hyperventilating. He keeps asking if they can call you." "And Courtney?" I asked. "She is screaming," Dante said. "She is on the phone with the bank manager threatening to sue them. She is telling them they are disrupting a thriving business. She is pulling the race card, the gender card, every card she has." "It won't work," I said calmly. "A bank contract doesn't care about your feelings, Dante. It only cares about the signature. And Mr. Franklin doesn't like surprises. What is she going to do?" "Thaddeus," I smiled at the river, "she is going to do the only thing a greedy person knows how to do when they are cornered. She is going to try to sell her way out of it." I hung up the phone. I packed up my tackle box. The fish were safe for today. But Julian and Courtney, they were already on the hook. Back at the distillery, the air in the executive suite was toxic. Courtney slammed the phone down so hard the receiver cracked. She stood up, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. "They can't do this," she hissed. It is predatory lending. It is discrimination. Julian came out of the bathroom, wiping his mouth with a paper towel. He looked pale. He looked like a child who had lost his mother in a grocery store. "5 million, Courtney," he whimpered. "We don't have 5 million. We have maybe 200,000 left after the renovation deposits. They are going to foreclose. They are going to take the building. They are going to take the cars." "Shut up," Julian, Courtney screamed. "Stop whining and think." She paced the room, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. She walked to the window and looked out at the warehouse. "We are sitting on a gold mine," she muttered. She turned to Julian, her eyes manic. "The inventory," she said. "The whiskey." Julian blinked. "What?" "The barrels, you idiot. We have 50,000 barrels of bourbon sitting in those warehouses." Thaddeus was hoarding it. He was sitting on it like a dragon. She grabbed a calculator. "If we sell 10,000 barrels, even at a wholesale discount, say $500 a barrel, that is $5 million. She started laughing. It was a jagged, hysterical sound. "We just sell the juice, Julian. We flood the market. We call up the distributors in Chicago and New York. We tell them we are clearing out the old stock to make room for the new product. They will buy it. Everyone wants King's Reserve. But," Julian hesitated, "that whiskey isn't ready. Thaddeus said the 4-year stuff needs 2 more years. And the reserve stock?" "Who cares?" Courtney yelled. "It is alcohol. It gets you drunk. People buy the label, not the taste. We bottle everything. We empty warehouse 2 and 3. We sell it in bulk to the blenders if we have to." She grabbed the phone again. "Get the bottling line manager in here. Tell him to cancel all time off. We are running 24-hour shifts. I want every drop of liquid in this place put into glass and shipped out by Friday." She looked at the bank letter and sneered. "They want their money. Fine. We will give them their money. And then we will sue them for emotional distress." Julian nodded slowly, catching her infectious desperation. Yeah, we can do that. We have the product. We are rich in product." They high-fived, a clumsy, desperate slap of hands. They thought they had found the escape hatch. They thought they could simply liquidate the legacy to pay the debt. But they didn't know. They didn't know that selling 10,000 barrels in a month requires shipping permits they didn't have. They didn't know that the distribution contracts had exclusivity clauses that prevented bulk dumping. And most importantly, they didn't know about the clause in the appendix of the transfer agreement, the clause that Dante and I had buried on page 42. The clause that said the inventory didn't belong to the company. I sat in my apartment that evening eating a sandwich. I looked at the calendar on the wall. 30 days down. The bank had fired the first shot. The acceleration clause was the warning bell. Now Courtney was going to panic. She was going to rush. She was going to try to move the inventory, and that was when she was going to run into the second trap, the one buried in the dirt. I took a bite of my sandwich. "You can't sell what you don't own, Courtney," I whispered to the empty room, "and you can't move heavy trucks over a toxic waste site without waking up the government." The phone rang again. It was Mrs. Higgins, my old bookkeeper, calling from her retirement home. She still had friends on the inside. "Thaddeus," she whispered, "they are firing up the bottling line. They are talking about draining Warehouse 3. "I know, Martha," I said gently. "They are going to ruin it," she cried. "That is the 2018 vintage. It is too young." "Let them try," I said. "But Thaddeus—" "Martha," I interrupted. "Do you remember the parking lot expansion project, the one they started digging yesterday?" "Yes. Well, tomorrow morning, those heavy trucks carrying the bottles have to drive over that new dirt." There was silence on the line. Then I heard her gasp. "The clay cap," she whispered. "Exactly. Go to sleep, Martha. Tomorrow is going to be a very loud day." I hung up. I walked to the window and looked toward the distillery. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The frantic energy, the greed, the desperation. Courtney thought the bank was her biggest problem. She thought $5 million was a lot of money. She had no idea that beneath the tires of her delivery trucks a much bigger bill was waiting to come due. A bill written in chemical sludge and federal fines. I poured myself a small glass of my private stock. To the bank I toasted, and to the acceleration clause. The dominoes were falling, and they were falling fast. The sun came up hot and angry over Kentucky that Wednesday. It was the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the air feel like a wet wool blanket. I was sitting on the fire escape of my apartment drinking lukewarm coffee, watching the smoke rise in the distance. Not smoke from a fire, but dust. Clouds of red dust billowing up from the south side of the distillery property. Courtney and Julian were in a panic. The bank had demanded $5 million in 30 days, and their brilliant plan was to drain the warehouses dry. To do that, they needed trucks, big trucks, 18-wheelers that could haul away 10,000 cases of whiskey in a single afternoon. But there was a problem. The old loading dock was built in 1970. It was designed for small box trucks, not modern semi-trailers. The turning radius was too tight. The drivers couldn't back in without jumping the curb. So Courtney did what she always did. She tried to force the world to fit her schedule. She hired a construction crew. She told them to bulldoze the south lawn. She wanted to pave it over to make a turnaround for the semi-trucks. She wanted a super highway for her getaway cars. I watched the dust cloud grow. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted bitter, but not as bitter as what was about to happen. You see, that patch of green grass on the south lawn wasn't just landscaping. It was a graveyard. Not for people, but for the sins of the past. Before I bought the land in 1974, it had belonged to a chemical textile plant. They had dumped runoff there for a decade. Solvents, dyes, heavy metals, things that turn the soil black and make the water taste like pennies. When I bought the land, I got it for pennies on the dollar because nobody else wanted the liability. I spent my first year of profits not on a new car, but on an environmental remediation team. We didn't dig it up because moving it would have cost millions. Instead, we capped it. We laid down a 3-foot layer of dense, impermeable blue clay. Then we put 2 feet of topsoil over that and planted Bermuda grass. I signed a consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a simple promise. I promised never to disturb the soil deeper than 12 inches. I promised that the clay cap would remain sacred. In exchange, they let me operate. It was all in the deed restriction. The same deed restriction that was listed as item 1 on the list I gave Dante. The same list Courtney and Julian had been too arrogant to read. My phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Higgins again. "Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The smell. Oh, Lord, the smell." I closed my eyes. I remembered that smell. It smelled like sulfur and burning tires. It smelled like a headache that started behind your eyes and worked its way down to your stomach. "They hit the clay," Martha, I asked. "They went right through it," she said. The foreman told Julian the ground felt soft. He told him it looked blue. Julian screamed at him. He told him time is money and to keep digging. The bulldozer blade went down 4 feet, Thaddeus. And then black sludge started bubbling up. I sighed. The genie was out of the bottle. And this genie was toxic. "Get out of there, Martha," I said. "Tell the girls in the office to evacuate. Do not breathe that air." I hung up. I didn't need to call the authorities. The EPA has sensors in the water table downriver. And besides, nothing draws a crowd like the smell of an environmental crime. Down at the distillery, pandemonium had broken out. The construction crew had stopped. The bulldozer operator had jumped out of his cab, retching coughing into his shirt. The black ooze was spreading, staining the fresh dirt tracks leaking toward the storm drains. Julian ran out of the office, covering his nose with a silk handkerchief. "What did you do?" he screamed at the foreman. "You burst a sewage pipe. You idiot, you hit a septic tank." "It ain't sewage, boss," the foreman yelled back, backing away, his eyes watering. "That is chemical. That is industrial waste." Courtney stormed out in her high heels, looking like a general whose army was retreating. "Fix it," she screeched. "Just cover it up. Pour concrete over it. We have trucks coming in 2 hours. This lot needs to be paved." She actually thought she could pour concrete over an active chemical breach. She thought she could just put makeup on a cancer. That was when the caravan arrived. It wasn't the local police. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a line of black SUVs with government plates. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need to. They moved with the terrifying silence of absolute authority. Men and women in hazmat suits jumped out of the back of a van. They had Geiger counters and air quality monitors. They set up a perimeter tape before Julian could even catch his breath. A man in a suit walked up to Courtney. He wasn't smiling. He held up a badge. "I am Agent Miller with the EPA Region 4, he said. "Who is the site supervisor?" Courtney straightened her spine, trying to summon her usual bluster. "I am the CEO, she said, "and you are trespassing on private property. We have a minor plumbing issue. We are handling it. You need to leave." Agent Miller looked at the black sludge bubbling up from the ground. He looked at the bulldozer sitting in the middle of the breach. Then he looked at Courtney. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and hard, "you have breached a Class 1 containment site. You have violated a federal consent decree, and based on the readings my team is getting right now, you have released volatile organic compounds into the air. He turned to his team. Shut it down. Shut it all down. Courtney gasped. You can't. We have orders to fill. We have a bank loan to pay. You can't shut down production. Agent Miller handed her a clipboard with a red piece of paper on it. This is a cease and desist order, he said. Effective immediately. No personnel allowed within 500 yards of this breach. The facility is closed until a full remediation plan is approved and executed. He pulled a pen from his pocket. And per the violation of the deed restriction, I am issuing an immediate fine for the breach, $500,000, payable within 10 days, plus the cost of the cleanup, which I estimate will run another $2 million. Courtney's knees buckled. She grabbed Julian's arm to stay upright. $500,000, she whispered, plus $50,000 a day for every day the breach remains open, Agent Miller added. He looked around the site. Where is Thaddeus King, he asked. He signed the original decree. He knows the protocols. He is... Retired? Courtney stammered. He doesn't work here anymore. Agent Miller shook his head. Well, you better find him, he said, because unless someone knows exactly what is buried under there and how to cap it, this site is going to be a ghost town for the next 6 months. He signaled to his team. They started putting red tags on the doors, the bottling line, the warehouse, the office. I sat on my fire escape and watched the flashing lights reflecting off the low clouds. The trucks from the distributors were probably turning onto the main road right now. They would see the police tape. They would see the hazmat suits. They would turn around and drive away, taking their checks with them. The whiskey was trapped. The warehouse was locked down. The bank loan was ticking. And now the government had just handed them a bill for $500,000 they didn't have. Courtney wanted to expand. She wanted to grow. She dug deep looking for a shortcut. But she forgot the most important lesson of the land. The earth remembers. You can bury the past, but if you dig it up with a bulldozer and no respect, it will rise up and choke you. My phone rang. It was Julian. I watched it ring. I watched the screen light up with his name. I took another sip of my coffee. Let it ring. Let them breathe the air they created. Let them stand in the mess they made. I wasn't going to save them. Not yet. Because the smell of that chemical sludge was the smell of my leverage coming home to roost. And to me, sitting safe in my apartment above the bakery, it smelled like victory. In the whiskey business, we have a poetic term called the angel's share. It refers to the portion of the distilled spirit that evaporates through the pores of the oak barrels as they age. We say that the alcohol goes up to heaven to keep the angels happy, so they will bless the rest of the batch. It is a romantic idea. It makes the tourists smile when they tour the rickhouses. They imagine little cherubs sipping bourbon on a cloud, but I know the truth. No. The angels are not cute little babies with harps. In this industry, the angels are greedy. They are demanding. And if you do not respect the physics of the wood, they will not just take a share. They will take everything. I sat in my apartment reading the local weather report. A cold front was moving in. The temperature was dropping 20 degrees overnight. In a normal distillery, this would not be a problem. The thermal mass of the liquid and the insulation of the warehouse would keep the internal temperature stable. But King's Reserve was no longer a normal distillery. It was a ship being steered by a captain who had fired the crew and sold the navigation charts. 3 days ago, Julian had sent out a memo titled Utility Cost Reduction Measures. I saw a copy of it because Mrs. Higgins forwarded it to me before she cleared out her desk. Julian looked at the electricity bill for the climate control systems in the warehouses and decided it was a waste of money. He thought that because the weather was hot outside, he could just turn off the humidifiers and the temperature regulators to save a few $1,000s. He fired the maintenance team, the men who knew how to tune the iron lung. He locked the control panels. He effectively suffocated the buildings. What Julian did not understand is that a whiskey barrel is not a sealed container. It is a puzzle held together by tension. The white oak staves are not glued. They are pressed together by steel hoops. When the wood is moist and warm, it swells, pushing against the steel, creating a watertight seal. It is a perfect marriage of nature and engineering. But when you cut the humidity and drop the temperature rapidly, the wood gets thirsty. It begins to dry out, and when wood dries, it shrinks. I sat by my window and waited. I knew the physics. I knew that right now, inside warehouse number 3, thousands of white oak staves were contracting. They were pulling away from each other just a fraction of a millimeter. The steel hoops, which relied on the outward pressure of the wood to stay in place, were starting to loosen. They were sliding down the belly of the barrels. Gravity was about to do the rest. It started at 3 in the morning. I was not there, but I heard the story later from the fire chief, who was a friend of mine. The night watchman was a new hire, a young man named Travis, who spent most of his shift playing video games on his phone in the guard shack. He noticed a smell. At first he thought he had spilled his hand sanitizer. Then he thought maybe he had left the cap off a cleaning bottle. But the smell got stronger. It became a heavy, sweet, stinging vapor that burned the back of his throat. It smelled like money evaporating. Travis walked toward the warehouses. The smell was so thick by the time he reached the courtyard that it made his eyes water. He approached warehouse number 3. The EPA tape was still fluttering in the wind from the soil disaster, but this was a new nightmare. He opened the side door. He didn't need a flashlight. The fumes hit him like a physical blow, knocking him backward. He gagged, coughing violently. When he finally managed to shine his light inside, he saw the catastrophe. It wasn't just a leak. It was a deluge. Hundreds of barrels on the lower racks had failed. The wood had shrunk so much that the bourbon was weeping out from between the staves. In some cases, the hoops had fallen off completely, causing the barrels to burst open like rotten fruit. Amber liquid was pouring down from the racks. It was cascading like waterfalls from the upper levels, splashing onto the concrete floor. It was a river of 20-year-old bourbon. The Founder's Reserve, the single barrel select, the liquid gold that was supposed to save the company from the bank. It was pooling on the floor 3 inches deep. Travis panicked. He pulled out his radio to call Julian, but he dropped it in the liquid. He turned to run, but he slipped. The floor was slick with high-proof alcohol. He scrambled out of the door, his clothes soaked in a fortune. He managed to dial 911 from the landline in the shack. When the fire trucks arrived, they didn't rush in with hoses. They stopped at the gate. The fire chief recognized the smell immediately. He got on his loudspeaker. "Evacuate the perimeter," he ordered. "Nobody goes in. Nobody starts a car. Nobody lights a cigarette." The air inside that warehouse was saturated with ethanol vapor. The concentration was so high that it was essentially a bomb waiting for a spark. If a light bulb flickered, if a static shock happened, the entire building would go up in a fireball that would be seen from space. I was awake when the phone rang. It was Dante. "Thaddeus," he said, his voice shaking, "you need to turn on the news." I turned on the small television in my kitchen. The news helicopter was circling the distillery. The spotlights were sweeping over the complex. I saw the fire trucks lining the road. I saw the yellow tape, and I saw Julian and Courtney standing in the parking lot wearing bathrobes, looking small and terrified. The reporter was breathless. "Breaking news from King's Reserve Distillery," she said. "A massive chemical leak has been reported. Fire officials say thousands of gallons of high-proof alcohol have flooded the main warehouse, creating an extreme explosion hazard. Authorities are considering evacuating the residential neighborhoods within a 1-mile radius." I watched Courtney arguing with the fire chief. I could tell she was screaming. She was pointing at the warehouse, probably demanding that they go in and save the product. She wanted them to scoop the bourbon off the floor. She wanted them to plug the holes. She didn't understand that you can't save a drowning man if the water is made of gasoline. The fire chief shook his head. He was a professional. He knew that the only thing you can do in that situation is vent the building and pray. I poured myself a cup of tea. It was Earl Grey. I imagined the angels inside that warehouse. They were angry. They had been disrespected. They had been treated like line items on a spreadsheet instead of the guardians of the spirit. So they decided to take their share all at once. They were drinking it from the floor. They were sucking it into the air. They were reclaiming the legacy from people who didn't deserve it. My phone buzzed again. It was Julian. I answered. "Grandpa," he sobbed. He actually called me Grandpa. He hadn't called me that since he was 12 years old, asking for money to buy a video game. "What is happening, Julian?" I asked, my voice calm. "It is gone," he cried. "It is all leaking out. The barrels, they just opened up. Why did they open up? We didn't touch them." I took a sip of tea. "You changed the temperature, Julian," I said. "You tried to save money on the climate control, but it is just air," he stammered. "It is just air conditioning." "How can air break wood?" "Because wood is alive, son," I said. "Wood breathes, and when you stopped feeding it the moisture it needed, it got thirsty. It shrank. It pulled away from the steel. I paused, letting the silence stretch out. You killed the barrels, Julian. You starved them to death, and now they are bleeding out. Fix it, he begged. Tell me how to fix it. I will turn the humidifiers back on. I will flood the place with steam. Just tell me what to do. It is too late, I said. You can't unshrink a stave once the seal is broken. The vacuum is gone. The pressure is gone. That whiskey is floor cleaner now. But the bank, he whispered. The bank wants $5 million. That whiskey was the money. Yes, I said. It was. I looked at the television screen. I saw a hazmat team preparing to enter the building to ventilate the fumes. They were moving slowly, carefully. That warehouse holds 50,000 barrels, Julian said. If even 10% of them failed, you have lost 5,000 barrels. That is roughly 250,000 gallons of hazardous flammable material. I did the math in my head. And Julian, do you know what the EPA fine is for an unpermitted discharge of volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere? He didn't answer. All I heard was his jagged breathing. It makes the fine for the soil contamination look like a parking ticket, I said. I hung up the phone. I watched the news for another hour. I watched as the sun began to rise, illuminating the disaster. The liquid was seeping out from under the warehouse doors now. It was staining the concrete dark. It was running toward the storm drains where the EPA agents were frantically throwing down absorbent booms. It was a tragedy. It broke my heart to see the waste. Years of my life, years of my patience washing away into the gutter. But it was a necessary tragedy. Sometimes you have to let the house burn down to prove to the insurance company that the wiring was faulty. Courtney and Julian had wanted the distillery. They wanted the prestige. They wanted the quick cash. Now they had a toxic waste site in the parking lot and a bomb in the warehouse. The angels had taken their share, and they had left the devil with the bill. I turned off the television. I had to get dressed. I had a feeling that Dante would be coming by soon with more paperwork, and I wanted to be wearing my best suit when the inevitable happened. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a matter of gravity, and gravity, like justice, never sleeps. The catfish in the muddy banks of the Kentucky River are not particular creatures. They do not care about your bank account. They do not care about your social standing. They only care about the bait on your hook and the patience in your hand. I was sitting on my folding canvas chair, the one with the frayed armrest, watching the red and white bobber dance in the gentle current. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and honeysuckle, a sharp contrast to the toxic cloud that I knew was currently suffocating my old property 5 miles down the road. I had turned off the ringer on my phone, but I had left the vibration on. It buzzed against my thigh like an angry hornet. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I ignored it. I watched a dragonfly land on the tip of my fishing rod. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It was persistent, desperate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the screen. The name flashing there was Courtney. I let it ring until the very last second. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted her to imagine that I was unreachable, that I had disappeared into the ether, leaving her alone with the disaster she had engineered. Finally, I slid my thumb across the screen. "Hello, Courtney." "Thaddeus," she screamed. It wasn't the cool, collected voice of the CEO anymore. It was a jagged, high-pitched shriek that cracked under the weight of panic. "Where are you? We have been trying to call you for 3 hours. Why aren't you answering your emails?" I adjusted my hat to block the sun. "I am retired, Courtney," I said slowly. "Retired people don't check emails. We fish. And right now, the bluegill are biting." "You have to come in," she gasped. She sounded like she was running. I could hear background noise sirens shouting the mechanical beep of heavy machinery backing up. "Thaddeus, you have to come back. Right now. It is a disaster. The warehouse, the barrels, everything is leaking." "I know," I said. "I saw the news. It looks expensive." "It is not just expensive, it is catastrophic," she yelled. "The fire department is threatening to condemn the building. The EPA is fining us every hour, and the bank just sent a default notice." She paused, taking a ragged breath. I could hear the desperation clawing at her throat. "We need you to fix it, Thaddeus. You know the systems. You know the ventilation. You know how to talk to the inspectors. You have to come down here and tell them it is a standard procedure or something. Tell them we can cap the soil." I reeled in my line a few inches. "I can't do that, Courtney." "What do you mean you can't?" She snapped, her old arrogance trying to surface through the fear. "We are offering you a job. We will hire you as a senior consultant. We will pay you. Name your price. $200 an hour, 300. Just get down here and turn off the mess. I looked at the river. The water was brown and steady, moving relentlessly toward the ocean. It didn't rush. It didn't panic. It just flowed. I chuckled softly. A consultant, I asked. You want to hire me? Yes, she said. Whatever title you want. Master Distiller Emeritus. Just come fix the ventilation. The wood is shrinking, Thaddeus. The whiskey is pouring out like blood. Julian is useless. He is hiding in his office crying. I need someone who knows the building. I leaned back in my chair. I would love to help you, Courtney. I really would. I hate to see good whiskey go to waste. It breaks my heart. Then come, she screamed. I will send a car. But I can't. I continued, my voice hardening. Because I have a legal obligation. What legal obligation? She demanded. The one you wrote, I said. There was a silence on the line. A heavy, confused silence. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was the copy of the contract I had signed in the glass conference room, the one she had been too greedy to read. I unfolded it, the paper crinkling near the microphone of the phone so she could hear it. Clause 17, paragraph B, I read aloud. The non-interference and severance agreement. I waited a beat. It states very clearly that the former owner, Thaddeus King, is strictly prohibited from entering the premises, contacting employees, or influencing the operational decisions of King's distillery in any capacity. I paused. It goes on to say that any violation of this clause will result in the forfeiture of my severance package and potential litigation for corporate sabotage. Thaddeus, that is ridiculous, Courtney argued, her voice trembling. We are waiving that. We are the owners. We can waive the contract. We are inviting you back. I don't know, Courtney, I said, playing the part of the timid old man perfectly. It sounds risky. You have very expensive lawyers. They told me that if I stepped foot on the property, I would be sued. They were very specific. They said I was a liability, that I was old wood that needed to be cleared out. I stopped reeling. I let the bait sit on the bottom. If I come down there, Courtney, and I touch those vents, if I try to fix the mess you made, I could be held liable for the damages. You could sue me for the leak. You could say I caused it. We wouldn't do that, she sobbed. We need you. You threatened to sue me for killing my wife, Courtney, I reminded her. My voice dropped to a whisper, cold as the river bottom. You threatened to dig up her medical records. You threatened to destroy my reputation to get this company. I took a deep breath. I don't trust you, and I certainly don't trust your waiver. I abide by contracts, Courtney. I am a man of my word, and my word is that I am gone. But the whiskey, she wailed. It is dying. The legacy is already dead, I said. You killed it when you fired Mrs. Higgins. You killed it when you poured concrete over the soil cap. You killed it when you turned off the humidifiers to save a nickel. Thaddeus, please, I am sorry, Mrs. Vance, I said, using her married name. It felt like a slap. I have to go. I have a fish on the line. And unlike you, I know how to handle something slippery without losing my grip. Thaddeus, don't you hang up on me. I will sue you, I will. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the screen. I looked at her name. And then, with a satisfaction deeper than any whiskey I had ever tasted, I pressed the red button. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time. The silence of the river rushed back in to fill the space where her screaming had been. The birds started singing again. The wind rustled the leaves. I didn't catch a fish that day. I didn't need to. I had just released the biggest catch of my life. I had let them go drifting downstream without a paddle, heading straight for the waterfall. I packed up my gear. I walked back to the road where I had called a taxi. As I rode back to the city, I passed the turnoff for the distillery. I could see the smoke. I could smell the faint, sweet scent of evaporated bourbon hanging over the valley. It was the smell of a funeral pyre. Courtney was alone now. Julian was hiding. The bank was calling. The EPA was fining. And the warehouse was bleeding out. She had asked for total control. She had demanded it. She had threatened me for it. And now she had it. She was the captain of the ship. She was the master of her fate. And she was sinking faster than a stone in the Kentucky River. The courtroom was cold. It was the kind of artificial, sterile cold that seeps into your bones and makes your old injuries ache. I sat at the defendant's table wearing the same charcoal suit I had worn to Beatrice's funeral. My hat rested on my knee. My hands were folded on the table. To my right sat Dante. He had 3 binders stacked in front of him. He looked ready for war, his jaw set tight, his pen tapping a silent rhythm against his legal pad. To my left, across the aisle, sat the plaintiffs, Courtney and Julian. If I hadn't known them, if I hadn't watched them tear apart my life's work with the enthusiasm of wolves tearing at a carcass, I might have felt sorry for them. They looked wrecked. Julian had lost 20 pounds. His suit hung off him like it was 2 sizes too big. His skin was gray, the color of old ash. He was shaking a constant, subtle tremor that made the water in the pitcher on their table vibrate. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the seal of the Commonwealth of Kentucky hanging on the wall above the judge's head as if he were trying to memorize the motto. But Courtney was putting on a performance worthy of Broadway. She was dressed in a modest black dress, high-necked with a single string of pearls. She wore no makeup, which was a calculated choice to highlight the dark circles under her eyes and the pallor of her skin. She held a handkerchief in her hand, twisting it, crumpling it, smoothing it out again. She looked fragile. She looked like a grieving daughter who had been taken advantage of by a cruel, calculating monster. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Patterson who had no patience for theatrics, banged her gavel. "We are here to hear the case of Vance versus King," she announced. "The plaintiffs allege bad faith transfer, fraudulent concealment of liabilities, and corporate sabotage." She looked over her glasses at the plaintiff's attorney. "You may proceed with your opening statement." Courtney's lawyer stood up. His name was Mr. Sterling. He was a man I had seen on billboards along the highway, the kind of lawyer who advertised that he would fight for you like a bulldog. He walked to the center of the room, unbuttoning his jacket, pacing back and forth to ensure the jury saw the indignation on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sterling began, his voice booming, "we are here today to discuss a tragedy, not just a financial tragedy, but a human one." He pointed a finger at Courtney. "Look at this woman. Mrs. Vance is a visionary. She is a young entrepreneur who wanted nothing more than to honor her late mother's legacy. She wanted to take the family business, King's Reserve, and bring it into the modern era. She wanted to grow it. She wanted to employ people. She wanted to succeed." Sterling turned and walked toward my table. He stopped 5 feet away from me. He looked down at me with pure disgust. But she never had a chance. Because this man, Mr. Thaddeus King, decided to destroy her. He walked back to the jury box, leaning on the railing. Mr. King was angry. He was bitter that the torch was being passed. He couldn't stand the idea that the younger generation might do it better than he did. So what did he do? Did he mentor them? Did he guide them? Did he help them navigate the complex waters of the distillery business? Sterling shook his head theatrically. Number. He did not. Instead, he set a trap. A malicious, calculated, and devastating trap. He walked over to the exhibit board and slapped a photo of the leaking warehouse onto it. He handed them a company that was rotting from the inside out, Sterling shouted. He handed them a piece of land that was sitting on top of a toxic chemical dump, a fact he conveniently forgot to mention during the transfer. He handed them a ventilation system that was so antiquated, so fragile that without his secret knowledge it was destined to fail. Sterling paced faster now, building momentum. He knew. He knew that the moment he walked out that door, the clock started ticking. He knew the bank loan had an acceleration clause that would bankrupt them in 30 days. He knew the soil cap would break if they tried to expand. He knew the barrels would leak if the vents weren't adjusted by hand. He stopped in the center of the room and spread his arms wide. He didn't just hand them the keys, ladies and gentlemen. He handed them a grenade with the pin pulled out. And then he walked away, went fishing, and waited for the explosion. He turned to look at me again. This wasn't a business transaction. This was sabotage. This was a man setting fire to his own house just so he could watch his stepchildren burn in it. He walked back to his table and placed a hand on Courtney's shoulder. She dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief, letting out a soft, audible sob. "We are asking the court to right this wrong," Sterling concluded. "We are asking for the restoration of funds. We are asking for punitive damages." He paused for effect. "We are demanding $10 million in compensation for the destruction of the King's Reserve brand and the emotional distress inflicted upon my clients." $10 million. A murmur went through the courtroom. I didn't flinch. I sat there stone-faced watching the show. They wanted $10 million. They wanted the money I didn't have. They wanted to take my retirement, my savings, my dignity, and the shirt off my back to pay for their own incompetence. Sterling sat down. Courtney squeezed his hand gratefully. "Call your first witness," the judge said. I call Mrs. Courtney Vance to the stand, Sterling said. Courtney stood up slowly. She walked to the witness stand as if she were walking to the gallows. She took the oath, her voice trembling just enough to sound brave. Mrs. Vance, Sterling said gently, "Tell the jury about the day you took over the company." Courtney took a deep breath. She looked at the jury, making eye contact with the grandmother in the front row. "It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life," she began softly. "My mother Beatrice loved that distillery. She always told me that one day it would be ours. When she passed Julian, and I just wanted to make her proud." She sniffled. "We went to Thaddeus. We asked him to stay on. We asked him to help us. We told him we respected his experience." I raised an eyebrow. That was a lie so bold it almost had its own gravitational pull. They had told me I was old. They had told me I was in the way. They had threatened to sue me for elder abuse. But the jury didn't know that. They saw a crying woman in a modest dress. "And what did Mr. King do?" Sterling asked. He smiled. Courtney said, a tear finally rolling down her cheek. He had this cold, scary smile. He put the keys on the desk and said, "It is all yours." He didn't warn us about the EPA. He didn't tell us about the bank clause. He just signed the papers and left. She looked at me then. Her eyes were wet, but behind the tears, I saw the same malice I had seen in my office. She was acting for her life. She knew that if she lost this case, she was going to prison for the environmental damage. She needed me to be the villain so she could be the victim. After he left, everything started to go wrong. She continued, her voice rising in pitch. The machines broke. The bank called the loan. The ground just opened up and started oozing sludge. We tried to fix it. We spent every penny we had trying to save the business. She broke down, then sobbing into her hands. I called him, she cried. I begged him for help. I told him the whiskey was leaking. I told him we were going to lose everything. And do you know what he said? What did he say? Sterling asked softly. He said he was fishing, she whispered. He said he didn't care. He said he hoped we drowned. The jury gasped. I saw the grandmother in the front row glare at me. It was a masterful performance. She took my silence, my adherence to the contract, and twisted it until it looked like malice. She took her own greed and painted it as ambition. She took her own failure and painted it as victimization. Sterling let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," he said. "No further questions." The judge looked at Dante. "Mr. Ross, your witness." Dante stood up. He didn't rush. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up a single piece of paper from his stack. He walked toward the witness stand. He didn't look angry. He looked like a teacher who was about to correct a student who hadn't done their homework. "Mrs. Vance," Dante said politely, "you stated that you asked Mr. King to stay on and help you. Is that correct?" "Yes," Courtney said, wiping her eyes. "We begged him." Dante nodded. He walked back to the defense table and picked up another document. "And yet," he said, holding up the paper, "I have here a draft of a lawsuit prepared by your legal team dated 3 days before the transfer. A lawsuit threatening to charge Mr. King with the wrongful death of your mother if he did not step down immediately." Courtney froze. Her hand stopped midway to her face. "Objection," Sterling shouted, jumping up. "That document is privileged. It was never filed. It goes to state of mind, Your Honor," Dante said calmly. "The witness claims she begged him to stay. This document suggests she threatened to destroy him if he didn't leave." "Overruled," the judge said. "The witness will answer." Courtney shifted in her seat. Her fragility started to crack. We were just exploring our options," she stammered. "We were concerned about Mom's care." "I see," Dante said. He put the paper down. "Let's talk about the transfer agreement. You signed it, correct?" "Yes." "And you read it?" "Of course I read it," she snapped, her tone sharpening. "I am a businesswoman." Dante smiled. "Then you are aware of the schedule of liabilities attached to the agreement." "Schedule of liabilities." She frowned. There was just a standard list. Dante walked to the projector. He placed a transparency on the glass. It was page 42 of the contract. The font was blown up so everyone could see it. Right there, Dante said, pointing with a laser pen. Item 1, EPA deed restriction regarding subsurface chemical containment. Item 2, First Commercial Bank Keyman acceleration clause. He turned to Courtney. "It is in bold text, Mrs. Vance, directly above your signature." Courtney stared at the screen. She blinked. She had never seen those words. She had been too busy counting the money in her head to read the paper in front of her. I must have missed that," she whispered. "You missed a toxic waste dump and a $5 million debt." Dante asked, his voice incredulous. It was hidden, she shouted, her mask slipping completely. He hid it. He tricked us. Dante turned off the projector. The room went slightly darker. Mrs. Vance, Dante said, walking closer to her. You claim Mr. King gave you a broken ship, but isn't it true that you fired the entire maintenance crew on your second day? We were cutting costs, she defended. Isn't it true you turned off the humidity control systems against the advice of the foreman? It was summer. It was hot. We didn't need heat. And isn't it true, Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, that you ordered the bulldozing of the south lot despite seeing the red markers indicating a containment zone? Courtney looked at Sterling for help. He was shuffling papers, looking frantic. He didn't tell us, she screamed, pointing at me again. He should have told us. He stood there and watched us sign our lives away. Dante stopped. He looked at me. Then he looked back at her. Mr. King gave you exactly what you asked for, Mrs. Vance. He gave you the assets, and he gave you the liabilities. You wanted to be the boss. Dante leaned in. Being the boss means reading the fine print. He turned his back on her. No further questions, Your Honor. Courtney sat there, her chest heaving. The jury was no longer looking at her with pity. They were looking at the screen where the words EPA deed restriction were burned into their retinas. She stepped down from the stand, her legs shaky. She walked back to her table and collapsed into her chair. Julian wouldn't even look at her. He was staring at his hands, shaking harder than before. Sterling stood up, trying to salvage the disaster. The defense is trying to confuse you with technicalities, he shouted to the jury. The fact remains that Mr. King acted in bad faith. He knew they would fail. He slammed his fist on the table. We demand justice. We demand $10 million to repair the damage this man caused. I sat there listening to him scream. $10 million. They still didn't get it. They thought this was about money. They thought they could sue their way out of a physics problem. I looked at Dante. He gave me a small nod. It was time. They had made their case. They had cried their tears. They had shown the world their greed. Now it was time to show them the one thing they had overlooked, the one sentence that would turn their demand for $10 million into a confession of theft. I reached into my pocket and touched the small velvet bag I had brought with me. Inside was not a piece of paper. It was a sample of what they were trying to sell. I took a deep breath. The trap was sprung. Now we just had to close the door. The courtroom was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a storm holding its breath before the lightning strikes. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer for Courtney and Julian, had finished his theatrics. He sat down, wiping his forehead, looking pleased with himself. He thought he had painted a masterpiece. He thought he had portrayed me as a vengeful old man who had spitefully destroyed his own legacy just to hurt his stepchildren. I did not move. I did not frown. I did not shake my head in disagreement. I simply sat there with my hands folded on the table, my hat resting on my knee. I have learned in 73 years that truth does not need to shout. Lies are loud. Lies are desperate. Truth is like the limestone bedrock under Kentucky. It just sits there waiting for you to dig deep enough to find it. The jury was looking at me. I could feel their eyes. They were judging the cut of my suit. They were judging the lines on my face. They were wondering if I really was capable of such malice. I met their gaze. I didn't try to look innocent. I just looked like a man who had nothing left to hide. Beside me, Dante Ross stood up. He did not rush. He did not knock over his water glass. He did not pace the floor like a tiger in a cage. He buttoned his jacket with a slow, deliberate movement. He adjusted his cuffs. He picked up a single file folder from the table. Your Honor, Dante said. His voice was not a boom like Sterling's. It was a clear, resonant baritone. It was the voice of a man who checks the foundation before he builds the house. We have heard a very moving story today, Dante continued, walking slowly toward the jury box. We have heard a story about a young, ambitious couple who wanted to carry on a family tradition. We have heard about their dreams. We have heard about their tears. And we have heard about how my client, Mr. Thaddeus King, allegedly snatched those dreams away. Dante stopped. He turned to look at Courtney. She was dabbing her eyes again, playing the victim to the very end. But a courtroom is not a place for stories, Dante said, his voice sharpening. It is a place for facts. And the facts of this case are not emotional. They are contractual. He opened the file folder. The plaintiffs claim that Mr. King acted in bad faith. They claim he transferred a broken company. They claim he withheld vital information about the environmental hazards and the financial obligations. Dante walked over to the witness stand where Courtney had just sat down. He didn't look at her. He looked at the empty air above her head. But let us look at the timeline. Dante held up a finger. On June 12th, the plaintiffs entered Mr. King's office uninvited. They presented him with a hostile takeover demand. They threatened him with a lawsuit regarding the care of his late wife. They demanded his resignation. He held up a second finger. On June 14th, they presented him with a contract their lawyers drafted, a contract that demanded full executive control. He held up a third finger. And on June 15th, Mr. King signed that contract. He gave them exactly what they asked for. Dante turned to the jury. Imagine you demand the keys to a car. You shout at the owner. You threaten him. You tell him he is too old to drive. You tell him you know the road better than he does. So the owner hands you the keys. He steps out of the car. He walks away. Dante paused. Then you get in the car. You drive at 100 miles an hour. You ignore the check engine light. You drive it off the road and into a swamp. And then you sue the owner because you didn't know how to drive a stick shift. A few jurors smiled. The grandmother in the front row nodded slightly. Sterling jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making prejudicial analogies. Overruled, the judge said. She was leaning forward. She was interested. Dante walked back to our table. He placed his hand on the thick stack of papers that was the transfer agreement. The plaintiffs claim they were tricked. They claim they didn't know about the EPA restriction. They claim they didn't know about the bank loan clause. He picked up the document. But here on page 42, in bold text directly above their signatures, are the warnings. Dante looked at Courtney. You signed this, Mrs. Vance. You testified that you are a businesswoman. You testified that you have a master's degree in business administration. Are you telling this court that you signed a $20 million contract without reading page 42? Courtney flinched. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again. If you didn't read it, that is negligence, Dante said. If you did read it and ignored it, that is arrogance. But in neither case is it the fault of Thaddeus King. Dante walked to the center of the room. But there is a more fundamental issue here. The plaintiffs keep saying they wanted the business. They kept shouting, "We want the business. We want the legacy." Dante shook his head slowly. They thought a business was a bank account. They thought it was a title on a business card. They thought it was a party with velvet ropes and influencers. He turned to look at me. For the first time, his face softened. Thaddeus King started this distillery with a shovel and a dream. He stood in freezing mud to lay the foundation. He slept in the warehouse to watch the temperature gauges. He negotiated with the EPA for 10 years to remediate that soil. He shook hands with the banker and staked his own name as collateral. Dante turned back to Julian and Courtney. A business is not just assets. A business is a living organism. It is a collection of responsibilities. It is a web of promises. A promise to the bank to pay on time. A promise to the government to protect the land. A promise to the employees to treat them with respect. And a promise to the customer to maintain quality. Dante's voice rose, filling the room. You demanded the business. You demanded the crown, but you didn't want the weight that comes with it. You fired the people who knew how to run the machines. You bulldozed the land that was protecting the community. You watered down the product to make a quick buck. He pointed at the defense table. Mr. King did not destroy this company. You did. You destroyed it because you treated it like an ATM machine instead of a legacy. You wanted the harvest, but you didn't want to do the planting. Courtney was staring at Dante with pure hatred. Julian was looking at his hands, trembling so hard the table was shaking. Dante walked over to the judge's bench. Your Honor, the defense moves for a dismissal of all charges. The plaintiff signed a total liability waiver. It is Exhibit A. It states that upon transfer, the new owners assume all operational risks known and unknown. He turned to the jury one last time. My client warned them. He told them to be careful with the numbers. He told them not to rush the whiskey. He told them not to open the warehouse. They ignored him. They mocked him. They called him old and useless. Dante stopped. He looked at me. Thaddeus King gave them the business. He gave them the opportunity of a lifetime. The fact that they burned it to the ground in 30 days is not fraud. It is a tragedy of their own making. Dante sat down. The courtroom was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Before it was the silence of judgment against me. Now it was the silence of realization. I looked at Julian. He was pale. He was sweating. He knew that Dante was right. He knew that he had been the one to order the bulldozer. He knew he had been the one to ignore the temperature gauges. I looked at Courtney. She wasn't looking at the jury anymore. She was looking at the exit. She was calculating. She realized that her victim act hadn't worked. She realized that the contract she had been so eager to sign was now a cage she had built for herself. The judge cleared her throat. She looked at the documents in front of her. She looked at the bold text on page 42. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, looking at the plaintiff's lawyer, "do you have any redirect?" Sterling stood up. He looked tired. He knew he was fighting a losing battle. He mumbled a few questions about intent and malicious compliance, but his heart wasn't in it. I sat there and felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't happy. No man is happy to see his life's work destroyed in a courtroom. But I felt clean. I had told the truth. I had kept my word. I had honored the contract. Dante leaned over to me and whispered, "How did I do?" I looked at him. I saw the young boy I had sent to law school. I saw the man who had stood by me when everyone else had run away. "You did good, son," I whispered back. "You built a strong barrel." Dante smiled. "But we aren't done yet," I said softly. Dante looked at me confused. "We defended the transfer," I said. "We proved they own the business." "Yes," Dante said. "That gets you off the hook for the $10 million. I looked across the aisle at Courtney. She was whispering frantically to her lawyer, pointing at some papers. "We proved they own the business," I repeated. "They own the liabilities. They own the fines. They own the debt." I reached into my pocket and touched the small velvet bag again. "But Dante," I said, my voice low, "we haven't talked about what they don't own." Dante's eyes widened. He remembered the appendix. He remembered the clause about the artisan property. "Thaddeus," he whispered, "are you sure? If we drop this now, it will destroy them completely. It won't just be bankruptcy. It will be humiliation." I looked at Julian. I remembered him as a boy running through the cornfields. I remembered trying to teach him to fish. I remembered the way he had laughed when he handed me that check for $100,000. "They wanted to erase me, Dante," I said. "They wanted to pretend I never existed. They wanted to take the King name and paste it on a bottle of swill." I took the velvet bag out of my pocket and placed it on the table. "It is time to remind them who the King really is." The judge looked up. "If there are no further witnesses, we will move to closing arguments." Dante stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "we have one final piece of evidence to submit. It is a clarification regarding the assets mentioned in the transfer agreement." Sterling frowned. "Objection. New evidence cannot be introduced at this stage." "It is not new evidence," Dante said calmly. "It is part of the original contract. It is an addendum that the plaintiffs seem to have overlooked." The judge adjusted her glasses. "Proceed," she said. Dante picked up the contract again. He turned to the very back, to the appendix, to the page that looked like boring standard storage agreements. He walked to the center of the room. Courtney stopped whispering. She looked at the paper in Dante's hand. She looked at me. And for the first time since she walked into my office a month ago, I saw genuine terror in her eyes. She knew she had missed something. She just didn't know how bad it was. But she was about to find out. She was about to find out that while she owned the bottle, she didn't own the soul inside it. The sound of a page turning in a quiet courtroom can sound like a thunderclap if you are listening hard enough. Dante turned the page of the contract. He turned another. He flipped past the signature page where Courtney and Julian had signed their names with such arrogant flourishes. He flipped past the standard liability waivers. He went all the way to the back of the thick stack of papers, to a section labeled Appendix C. Mr. Sterling was still standing looking confused. He had expected a legal argument about intent or good faith. He had expected Dante to argue that I was a nice old man. He did not expect Dante to be reading the inventory storage addendum. "Your Honor," Dante said, his voice calm and precise, "the plaintiffs have argued that they purchased the business known as King's Reserve. They argue that this purchase entitles them to damages because the business is failing." Dante looked up from the paper. He looked directly at Courtney. "They are correct. They did purchase the business. They purchased the corporate entity. They purchased the land. They purchased the equipment. They purchased the debts and the liabilities." He paused. I but they seemed to be under the impression that they purchased the whiskey. Courtney frowned. Her forehead wrinkled. She leaned over to her lawyer and whispered something. Sterling shook his head, looking annoyed. "Of course we purchased the whiskey," Sterling said, chuckling as if Dante were a child. "We bought the distillery. A distillery makes whiskey. Therefore, we own the inventory. It is standard asset acquisition." Dante smiled. It was the smile of a man who is about to drop a piano on someone's head. "In most cases, you would be right, Mr. Sterling. But King's Reserve is not a standard distillery, and Thaddeus King is not a standard businessman." Dante held up the document. In 1974, when Mr. King incorporated this business, he included a specific clause regarding the classification of assets. He did this to protect his craft from investors who might want to rush the aging process. Dante pointed to a paragraph at the bottom of the page in small, dense print. "I would like to read into the record the definition of inventory as listed in Appendix C, Section 4 of the transfer agreement signed by both plaintiffs on June 15th. The judge leaned forward. "Read it, Mr. Ross." Dante adjusted his glasses. He read slowly, enunciating every syllable. "The corporate entity known as King's Distillery retains ownership of all physical infrastructure, machinery, and raw materials, including undistilled grain and water. However," Dante paused. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "However, any spirit that has been barreled and placed in the rick house for aging is hereby designated as artisan's personal property. This inventory is defined as a work of art in progress solely owned by the master distiller Thaddeus King and is held in trust by the facility for storage purposes only. This ownership is non-transferable with the corporate entity and remains with the artisan until he chooses to bottle or sell it." Dante stopped reading. He looked up. "The transfer agreement explicitly states that the new owners assume the obligation to store and protect this artisan property, but they do not acquire title to it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air right out of the room. Sterling froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at his copy of the contract. He started flipping pages frantically, ripping one in his haste. He found Appendix C. His eyes scanned the text. His face went from red to a pale, sickly gray. Courtney was staring at Dante. She didn't understand yet. The legal language was too dense. She looked at Julian. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Her voice echoed in the silent room. "Julian, what is he saying?" Julian didn't answer. He was staring at me. He understood. He had grown up around the business enough to know what artisan's personal property meant. "It means," Julian croaked, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "It means we don't own the bourbon," what Courtney snapped. "That is ridiculous. We own the barrels. We own the warehouse. You own the wood," Dante corrected her gently. "You own the metal hoops. You own the warehouse walls. But the liquid inside, the 50,000 barrels of aging whiskey, the Founder's Reserve. The 20-year stock." Dante shook his head. "That belongs to Thaddeus King." "No," Courtney screamed. She jumped up, knocking her chair over. "That is a lie. That is a trick. You can't just separate the liquid from the barrel. That is impossible." "It is not impossible, Mrs. Vance," Dante said. "It is contract law, and you signed it." He pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. "You agreed to store Mr. King's private collection. You agreed to maintain the climate control to protect his property. And most importantly," Dante's voice turned hard as steel, "you had no legal right to sell it." The realization hit Courtney like a physical blow. She staggered back, grabbing the edge of the table. She had just spent the last week bottling thousands of gallons of whiskey. She had shipped it to distributors. She had cashed the checks. If she didn't own the whiskey, then she hadn't just made a bad business deal. She had sold stolen property. Sterling looked up from the contract. He looked at the judge. He looked at Dante. He closed his briefcase. "Your Honor." Sterling said, his voice shaking. "I need a recess. I need to review this document with my clients." "Denied," the judge said. Her eyes were hard. She looked at Courtney. "Mrs. Vance, are you telling this court that you have been liquidating inventory that is explicitly defined as the personal property of the defendant?" "We didn't know," Courtney shrieked. "It was in the fine print." He hit it. "It is in the contract you signed," the judge snapped. "Ignorance of the terms is not a defense for theft." Theft. The word hung in the air. I finally moved. I reached for the velvet bag on the table. I loosened the drawstring. I pulled out a small sample bottle of amber liquid. I placed it on the table. The glass clinked softly against the wood. "This is my property, Courtney," I said. My voice was low, but in that silent room it sounded like a judge's gavel. "You wanted the company. You have the company. You have the EPA fines. You have the bank debt. You have the broken machines." I pointed at the bottle. "But this, the soul of the place, the thing that makes it worth money, that goes with me." Julian put his head in his hands and started to sob. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was the cry of a man who realizes he has just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. $5 million, Julian whispered. "The bank wants $5 million. The whiskey was the only asset we had to pay them. If we don't own the whiskey, then you are bankrupt," Dante finished for him. Technically, Dante added, twisting the knife, "you are worse than bankrupt, because you have already sold about $1 million worth of Mr. King's property. That constitutes grand larceny. And since you shipped it across state lines to distributors in Chicago, that makes it a federal crime. Wire fraud, interstate trafficking of stolen goods." Courtney looked at Sterling. "Do something," she screamed. "Argue with him. Tell him it is invalid." Sterling stepped away from her. He physically took a step back. "I cannot suborn perjury, Mrs. Vance," he said coldly. "The contract is clear. If you sold that inventory, you have committed a felony. I cannot represent you in a criminal matter." He looked at the judge. "I move to withdraw as counsel, Your Honor." "Granted," the judge said. Courtney stood alone. Her lawyer had abandoned her. Her husband was broken. Her stepfather, the man she had tried to destroy, sat calmly across the aisle holding a bottle of the whiskey she had tried to steal. She looked at me. Her eyes were pleading. She was searching for any shred of the man who used to pay for her vacations, the man who used to buy her birthday presents. "Thaddeus," she whispered, "you can't do this. You can't let them arrest me. We are family." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had bulldozed the toxic soil. I looked at the woman who had fired Mrs. Higgins. I looked at the woman who had turned off the vents and let the angels choke. I stood up. I picked up my hat. "You wanted a transition, Courtney," I said. "You wanted a new era." I put my hat on. "Welcome to the new era. It is called accountability." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense rests." The judge nodded. "Case dismissed," she said. She banged her gavel. But the sound didn't end there. As the gavel hit the wood, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 men in suits walked in. They weren't lawyers. They were wearing badges on their belts. FBI. They had been waiting. Dante had sent the tip about the interstate shipment of stolen goods 3 days ago. Courtney saw them. Her face went white. She looked at the exit, but there was nowhere to go. I walked past her. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I just walked. Julian grabbed my sleeve as I passed. "Grandpa," he wept. "Please. The bank, the debt, help us." I looked down at his hand on my jacket. I gently removed it. "I warned you, Julian," I said softly. "I told you the numbers bite." I walked out of the courtroom. Dante was right beside me. "Thaddeus," Dante said as we hit the hallway. "That was cold." I looked at the young man. "Cold. No, Dante. That was just physics." I walked toward the elevator. I had my legacy back. The whiskey was mine. The barrels were mine. But the building, the land, the debt that belonged to the Vances. And they were about to find out just how heavy a crown can be when you don't have the neck to hold it up. The judge had left the bench. The gavel had fallen. The FBI agents were standing by the double doors, patient and silent, waiting for the civil matter to conclude before they began their criminal proceedings. But for a few moments there was a strange, suspended reality in that courtroom. It was the moment when the adrenaline fades and the cold, hard math of survival kicks in. Courtney was still gripping the edge of the mahogany table. Her knuckles were white. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together wrong. She looked at me then, at the contract, then back at me. She was trying to run the numbers in her head. She was trying to find a loophole. She was trying to find an exit. But there were no exits. I had bricked them all up one by one over the last 30 days. Julian was slumped in his chair. He wasn't looking for a loophole. He was staring at the ceiling, his mouth slightly open, breathing in short, shallow gasps. He knew. He had grown up in the distillery. He knew exactly what it meant to own the wood but not the water. Thaddeus Courtney whispered. Her voice was trembling. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement. This doesn't make sense. If you own the whiskey, then what do we own? I walked over to their table. I didn't sit down. I stood over them, casting a long shadow that stretched across their legal papers and their spilled water glasses. I looked down at them with the pity one feels for a creature that has run itself off a cliff. You own the shell, Courtney, I said softly. She blinked, confused. The shell. I gestured to the window toward the distant hills where the distillery stood. You own the land, I explained. The land that is currently oozing toxic sludge. The land that the EPA has fined you $500,000 for disturbing. You own that debt. I pointed to the stack of papers on the table. You own the mortgage, the $5 million loan that the bank has accelerated. You owe that money today, not the company, you, personally, because you signed the personal guarantee. I leaned in closer. You own the broken boiler. You own the leaking roof. You own the payroll for the staff you haven't fired yet. You own the electric bill. You own the rats in the basement. I paused. You own the corpse, Courtney, but I own the soul. Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a mind snapping. The soul, he muttered. The whiskey is the soul. Exactly, I said. I picked up the sample bottle of amber liquid I had placed on the table earlier. I held it up to the light. It glowed with a rich, deep copper color. This is 50 years of my life, I said. This is Beatrice's memory. This is the sweat of the men you fired. This is the patience you never had. I set the bottle back down. And since the court has just ruled that this is my personal property sitting inside your warehouse, we have a problem. Courtney looked up. Her eyes were desperate. We can work something out, she stammered. We can buy it from you? We can set up a payment plan. We will pay you a royalty. 10%. No 20%. I shook my head. I don't do business with thieves, Courtney, and I certainly don't do business with people who desecrate the land. Then what do you want? She cried. I adjusted my cuffs. I looked at Dante, who was standing beside me, his face impassive but his eyes shining with a fierce pride. I want my property returned, I said. Courtney frowned. Returned. Yes, I said. You are currently in possession of 50,000 barrels of my artisan bourbon. I did not give you permission to store it. I did not sign a lease agreement with you. I checked my watch. So as the owner of said property, I am issuing a formal demand. I want my goods removed from your premises. Remove them, Julian whispered. Yes, I said. I want them out. All of them. Courtney looked at me as if I had asked her to move the moon. Thaddeus, she said, her voice rising in panic. That is 50,000 barrels. They weigh 500 pounds each. We can't just move them. It would take months. It would take a fleet of trucks. That sounds like a logistical problem, I said. And since you are the CEO of a logistics company, I assume you can figure it out. I can't, she screamed. The EPA has the site locked down. We can't bring trucks in. The roads are blocked. I shrugged. Then I guess you are in a bind. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket. I opened it to a blank page. I took out my pen. You see, Courtney, in the storage business space is money, and you are currently occupying 50,000 spots that you don't own. You are holding my property hostage in a facility that is unsafe, leaking, and legally compromised. I started writing on the pad. So here is the deal. I will give you 24 hours. 24 hours, she gasped. 24 hours to move 50,000 barrels of whiskey to a safe bonded location of my choosing, I said. And if we can't, she asked, tears streaming down her face. I looked up from my notepad. Then I will have to charge you rent. Rent, Julian asked. Storage fees, I corrected him. Unauthorized storage of hazardous high-value artisan goods. I tapped the pen against my chin, pretending to calculate. Now usually a bonded warehouse charges a few dollars a month per barrel. But this isn't a normal situation. My property is at risk. My property is sitting above a toxic waste site. My property is being mishandled by incompetent management. I looked them dead in the eye. So the risk premium applies. I wrote a number on the paper. $100, I said. $100 a month, Courtney asked, hopeful. No, I said. $100 per barrel. Per day. The room went silent again. The kind of silence that happens when a bomb goes off and your ears are ringing so loud you can't hear the debris falling. Julian's eyes rolled back in his head for a second. He was doing the math. I could see his lips moving. 50,000 barrels, he whispered. Times $100, I added. Julian stopped. He looked at Courtney. He looked at me. That is $5 million, he choked out. Correct, I said. $5 million a day, Courtney screamed. That is extortion. That is impossible. You can't charge that. I can, I said calmly. And I will. It is a standard penalty rate for unauthorized retention of assets. Dante has the paperwork ready. I tore the page out of my notebook and slid it across the table. It landed right next to the voided check for $100,000 they had tried to give me a month ago. $5 million a day, Courtney. Starting tomorrow at noon. I leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. Let's look at your cash flow, shall we? I counted on my fingers. You owe the bank $5 million today. You owe the EPA $500,000 next week. You owe the cleanup crew $2 million. And starting tomorrow, you owe me $5 million every single day that my whiskey sits in your warehouse. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of the reaper. By Friday, you will owe me $20 million. By next week, you will owe me more than the GDP of a small country. Courtney stared at the paper. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish on a dock. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the numbers was crushing her chest. You planned this, she whispered. You knew. You knew we couldn't move it. You knew we couldn't pay it. I stood up straight. I gave you exactly what you wanted, Courtney. You wanted the business. You wanted the keys. You wanted to be the boss. I put my pen back in my pocket. Well, this is what being the boss looks like. It looks like bills you can't pay and problems you can't solve. I turned to Dante. Send the invoice, Dante. Net zero terms. Payable upon receipt. Dante nodded, his face grim but satisfied. Consider it done, Thaddeus. I looked back at the Vances one last time. They were holding hands now, not out of love, but out of sheer terror. They were clinging to each other as the ship went down. You have 24 hours, I said. I suggest you start carrying barrels. I turned and walked away. Behind me I heard a sound. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was the soft, dull thud of a body hitting the floor. Julian had fainted. The math had finally hit him harder than any fist ever could. $5 million a day. It was a number so big it didn't just bankrupt you. It erased you. I didn't turn around. I kept walking toward the door where the FBI agents were waiting. My work here was done. The shell was crushed. The account was closed. And the King's Reserve. It was safe, because they couldn't move it, they couldn't sell it, and they certainly couldn't pay for it. The only way out was total surrender, and even that might not be enough to save them now. The sound of a man hitting the floor in a quiet courtroom is heavier than you might expect. It is a dead weight sound, a final sound. Julian didn't swoon like a lady in an old movie. He crumbled, his knees unlocked, his eyes rolled back, and he went down like a sack of wet grain. The math had killed him. The realization that he owed me $5 million a day had simply shut down his brain. I didn't move to help him. I stayed where I was, my hand resting on the neck of the whiskey bottle I had placed on the table. But Courtney didn't faint. She exploded. When she saw her husband hit the floor, she didn't kneel beside him. She didn't call for a medic. She screamed. It was a raw, animalistic sound that tore through the air conditioning and bounced off the wood paneling. She started clawing at the table, her fingernails scratching deep grooves into the varnish. "You did this," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You ruined us. You planned this. You are a monster." She lunged toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. The FBI agents were fast. They stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Ma'am, step back," the agent ordered. "I am not stepping back," she yelled, spitting the words. "He stole my company. He stole my life. He is charging me rent for my own warehouse." She turned to the judge, who was banging the gavel in vain. "Tell him to stop. Tell him he can't charge $5 million. I don't have it. I don't have anything." The agents grabbed her arms. That was when she broke. She started thrashing, kicking, screaming obscenities that made the court stenographer flinch. It wasn't the reaction of a CEO. It was the reaction of a cornered rat realizing the trap had snapped shut. They dragged her out. Her screams echoed down the hallway long after the doors swung shut. "I will kill you, Thaddeus. I will burn it all down." I stood alone in the center of the room. Julian was being loaded onto a stretcher by the paramedics. He looked small, defeated. He woke up just as they were wheeling him out. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused, filled with a terror that would never leave him. I put my hat on. I picked up my sample bottle. The show was over. But the cleanup was just beginning. The collapse of the Vance empire was fast. It was brutal. It was efficient. When you owe the bank $5 million, the government $2 million, and a private creditor, me $20 million by the end of the week, there is no reorganization. There is no Chapter 11. There is only immediate total liquidation. The bank moved first. Mr. Franklin, the bank president, who had trusted me for 30 years, didn't hesitate. He invoked the foreclosure clause on the real estate. He seized the accounts. He seized the cars. He seized the house on the hill where Beatrice and I had lived. Then came the EPA. They placed a federal lien on every asset Courtney and Julian owned personally. Their personal bank accounts were frozen. Their credit cards stopped working. But the final nail in the coffin was my invoice. I sent it every morning at 9 a.m. to King's Distillery Management. Daily storage fees for artisan property. Amount due $5 million. No investor would touch them. Who would buy a company that was bleeding $5 million a day in debt? The company was toxic. It was radioactive. Within 48 hours, they filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I sat in my apartment and watched the auction online. It happened 2 weeks later. The bank was auctioning off the distillery to recoup their losses. But there was a catch. Whoever bought the distillery also had to assume the EPA liability, and whoever bought the distillery had to negotiate with the owner of the inventory, me, or continue paying the storage fees. The auctioneer started the bidding at $10 million. Silence. $5 million. Silence. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted the headache. Nobody wanted to fight Thaddeus King. $1 million, the auctioneer pleaded. I was the only person in the room holding a paddle. I sat in the back row wearing my work boots. I raised my paddle. $100,000, I said. The auctioneer looked at the bank representative. Mr. Franklin nodded. He just wanted it off his books. He knew I was the only one who could fix the mess. Sold, the auctioneer said, slamming his hammer down. To Thaddeus King for $100,000. I walked up to the podium. I pulled a check out of my pocket. It was the same cashier's check for $100,000 that Julian had given me as a retirement gift a month ago. I handed it to the clerk. I am buying my life back, I said, and I am using their money to do it. The irony was sweet, but the work ahead was bitter. I drove my old truck up the driveway to the distillery. The gates were locked with chains. Weeds were already growing through the cracks in the asphalt where the toxic sludge had spilled. I cut the chain with bolt cutters. I walked into the office. It smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Courtney's white lacquer desk was covered in dust. There were papers scattered everywhere, unpaid bills, threatening letters, court summons. I didn't sit at the desk. I walked out to the warehouse. I opened the doors. The smell of vinegar and spoiled mash hit me. The fans were off. I walked to the control panel. I flipped the breaker. The iron lung shuddered. The gears ground together. And then slowly, rhythmically, the vents opened. A fresh breeze from the river rushed in. I took a deep breath. "We are back in business," I whispered to the barrels. But I needed a crew. I hired back Mrs. Higgins first. Then the bottling line. Then the maintenance team. We had a lot of cleaning to do. About a week later, I was inspecting the damage to the loading dock when I saw a figure standing at the gate. He was wearing dirty jeans and a torn t-shirt. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a drifter. He looked like a ghost. It was Julian. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had been sleeping under a bridge. His arrogance was gone, scraped away by the rough concrete of rock bottom. I walked over to the gate. I didn't open it. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked. He looked at his boots. "I need a job, Thaddeus," he whispered. I laughed. A short, sharp sound. "A job. You want to be a consultant again?" "No," he said, his voice cracking. "I have nothing. Courtney left. She took the cash from the safe and ran. The lawyers took the condo. The bank took the car. I am sleeping at the shelter downtown." He looked up at me. His eyes were red and hollow. "I need to eat, Thaddeus. Please. I will do anything." I looked at him. I saw the boy Beatrice had loved. I saw the man who had tried to destroy me. I could have turned him away. I could have told him to rot. It would have been justice. But I looked at the whiskey barrels stacked in the yard. They needed scrubbing. They were covered in the sticky residue of the leak. It was backbreaking, miserable work. I opened the gate. "I am not hiring a consultant, Julian," I said. "I know," he said. "I am hiring a barrel washer." He flinched. That was the lowest job in the distillery. The job they gave to the new guys to test if they had the grit. "Minimum wage," I said. 12 hours a day. No phone, no breaks except for lunch. I waited. "And one more thing," I added. What he asked. "Every dollar you earn, 50 cents of it goes to paying back the debt you owe the company. It will take you about 300 years to pay it off." He stood there calculating the misery. He looked at the road behind him leading to nowhere. He looked at the distillery, the only home he had ever really known. "I will take it," he whispered. "Grab a brush," I said, pointing to the bucket of soapy water by the dock. "And Julian." He looked at me. "If you miss a spot, I will fire you." He nodded. He dropped his backpack. He picked up the brush. He got on his knees and started scrubbing the toxic sludge off the concrete. I watched him for a moment. It wasn't forgiveness. It was penance. He was working off his sins one scrub at a time. As for Courtney, she didn't stick around to scrub floors. 2 days after the verdict, the FBI raided the hotel room where she was staying. It was empty. She had cleared out the minibar and left through the fire escape. But you can't run from the IRS. When Dante had exposed the illegal sales of my inventory, he had triggered a federal audit. It turned out Courtney hadn't just stolen the whiskey. She hadn't reported the income from the illegal sales. She had wired the money to an offshore account in the Caymans thinking she was clever. Tax fraud, wire fraud, flight to avoid prosecution. Her face was on the news that night, not as a 30 under 30 entrepreneur, but as a fugitive. Wanted Courtney Vance, armed and dangerous. I sat in my office, my old office with the wood paneling restored, and watched the report. They showed a grainy photo of her at an ATM in Mexico wearing a wig looking over her shoulder. She was running. She would always be running. She would never sleep in a soft bed again. Every knock at the door, every siren, every shadow would be a reminder of what she had done. That was a worse prison than any cell. I turned off the TV. I looked at the photo of Beatrice on my desk. I had put it back in its rightful place. "We did it, B," I whispered. "The house is clean." I poured 2 glasses of the 20-year reserve, the stuff that had survived the leak, the stuff that had survived the greed. It tasted smooth. It tasted like victory, but it also tasted like sadness. Because you can win the war, but you can never get back the time you spent fighting it. I looked out the window at Julian scrubbing the concrete in the rain. He was finally learning the lesson I had tried to teach him for 20 years. You can't cheat the work. You can't cheat the wood. And in the end, the bill always comes due. It has been 6 months since the auction. 6 months since I walked back through those gates with a check for $100,000 and a heart full of hope. The air in the distillery does not smell like sulfur anymore. It does not smell like the rot of greed or the chemical burn of a toxic spill. It smells like roasted corn. It smells of charred white oak. It smells like patience. I stood in the center aisle of warehouse number 1. The light was streaming in through the open bay doors, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This is the smell of my life. It is the smell of the earth giving up its sugar to the fire. But today the warehouse was not silent. It was filled with voices. I opened my eyes and looked at the group standing in a semicircle around me. There were 12 of them. They were young. They were black, white, Hispanic. They were kids from the neighborhood, kids from the foster system kids, who had been told by society that they were broken goods. They wore steel-toed boots that were a little too big and safety glasses that slid down their noses. I looked at a young man named Marcus. He was 19. He had a scar running down his cheek and eyes that were old for his age. He reminded me of myself 50 years ago, hungry and angry and looking for a place to put his hands to work. "Marcus," I said, my voice echoing off the high tin roof. "Step forward." Marcus stepped up, looking nervous. He wiped his hands on his work pants. I pointed to the barrel in front of us. It was a fresh barrel filled just this morning. The wood was still weeping sap from the heat of the char. "Put your hand on the stave," I said. Marcus hesitated. He reached out and touched the rough wood. "What do you feel?" I asked. "It is warm, Mr. King," he said. "It is vibrating a little." I smiled. "That is the yeast, Marcus. It is alive. It is eating the sugar and turning it into spirit. It is working in the dark where no one can see it. I looked at the group. Most people think whiskey is made by machines, I told them. They think it is about branding and marketing and velvet ropes. I had a family once who thought that. They thought they could buy the prestige without doing the work. I paused, letting the lessons sink in. But you cannot buy character. You have to build it. Just like this barrel. If the wood is weak, the whiskey leaks. If the wood is strong, it holds the pressure. I walked down the line, looking each of them in the eye. You are here because the world told you that you were liabilities. But in this building, we don't believe in liabilities. We believe in potential. I am going to teach you how to be coopers. I am going to teach you how to be distillers. I am going to give you a trade that no one can ever take away from you. Marcus smiled. It was a real smile, wide and bright. Thank you, Mr. King, he said. Don't thank me yet, son, I said, patting his shoulder. You have 3,000 barrels to roll before lunch. Get to work. They laughed. They scrambled to their stations. The sound of barrels rolling across the concrete floor filled the air. It was a thunderous, beautiful rhythm. It was the heartbeat of the distillery starting up again. I walked toward the open door. Outside, the sun was setting over the Kentucky hills. The sky was a bruised purple and gold. In the distance, near the loading dock, I saw a solitary figure. He was bent over scrubbing the tire of a delivery truck with a soapy brush. He was wearing a gray uniform with the name Julian stitched on the pocket. He looked up and saw me. He saw the kids working inside. He saw the life returning to the place he had almost killed. He didn't wave. He didn't scowl. He just nodded a small, humble dip of his chin and went back to scrubbing. He was paying his debt. It would take him a lifetime, but for the first time in his life, he was doing something honest. I walked back to the main house. I walked into my office. It was quiet here. The photos were back on the wall. The awards were polished. I went to the cabinet and pulled out a bottle. It wasn't just any bottle. It was from the batch that had survived the leak. The batch that had sat in the dark, watching the chaos, absorbing the trauma and turning it into flavor. I poured 2 glasses. I sat down in my leather chair. I looked at the picture of Beatrice on my desk. Her eyes were warm. She looked like she knew. She always knew. I lifted my glass to her photo. The amber liquid swirled heavy and rich. I did it, B, I whispered. The boys are safe. The wood is swelling. The angels are getting their share again. I took a sip. It burned, then it soothed. It tasted of caramel oak and redemption. I leaned back, feeling the ache in my old bones, an ache that felt like satisfaction. You see, Beatrice, I said to the empty room. You can't rush the fermentation. You can't force the spirit. I looked out the window at the first stars appearing in the night sky. Ru ngan kan thoi jan, I whispered, using the phrase she used to love. Good wine needs time. I smiled. And justice is the same way. It might be slow, it might sit in the dark for years, but when you finally uncork it, oh, it has a kick. I finished the glass. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark listening to the hum of the distillery, the sound of a legacy that was finally truly mine. Greed is a fire that consumes the arsonist first. My stepchildren thought inheritance was a right, not a responsibility. They saw the golden egg but tried to slaughter the goose. I taught them that ownership is nothing without knowledge and a title is useless without respect. You cannot steal a legacy, you can only earn it. True wealth isn't in the bank account or the real estate deed. It's in the mastery of your craft and the integrity of your soul. When you try to take what isn't yours, be careful, you might just get exactly what you asked for. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. And tell me in the comments below, do you think Julian deserves a second chance? Or should Thaddeus have kicked him to the curb? I read every single comment. Thanks for watching, and remember, keep your head up and your foundation strong. See you in the next video.